The Boeing B-29 Superfortress has certainly earned its reputation as the premier heavy bomber of World War II. This legendary aircraft played a massive role in the air war against Japan. Engineers packed this bomber with technology that had never been seen on any production aircraft before. For starters, the B-29 was the first production aircraft in the world to feature remote-controlled defensive armament. On top of that, it was the first bomber to get a centralized fire control system. It also featured fully pressurized crew compartments. This was a massive upgrade. It made high-altitude flying a lot easier. But today, these innovations are often overlooked. Nowadays, the Superfortress is almost exclusively remembered for dropping the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This event changed the course of history forever. The story of the B-29 actually starts with the Boeing Model 316 bomber project. That design was basically a heavily upgraded version of an older concept. This was the XB-15. Engineers had developed it way back in 1934. The main difference between the Model 316 and the older XB-15 was a major layout change. They switched from a low wing to a high wing configuration. They also added a tricycle landing gear setup. This gave it better stability during takeoff and landing. Since the old XB-15 was seriously underpowered, Boeing decided to equip the new Model 316 with 4 powerful engines. These were 18-cylinder, air-cooled Wright R3350 duplex Cyclone radial engines. Each one produced 2,000 horsepower on takeoff. But there was a major catch. When they were designing the Model 316, these highly promising engines were still in development. They were nowhere near ready for flight. The next step in this evolution was the Boeing Model 322 project. It came about in March 1938. It was a quick response to the Army Air Corps asking for an upgraded version of the B-17 Flying Fortress. The top requirements were a pressurized cabin and tricycle landing gear. By that point, Boeing already had plenty of experience with this kind of tech. They had successfully used it on their commercial airliner, the Model 307 Stratoliner. This was the very first production civilian aircraft with a pressurized cabin. Visually, the military Model 322 looked a lot like the passenger Stratoliner. It was basically a hybrid. Engineers took a new, much wider fuselage. They mated it to the standard wings and tail section from the tried-and-true B-17. Following the military specs, the designers fitted it with a nose gear. They powered the bomber with 4 Pratt & Whitney R2180 radial engines. According to engineering estimates, the new bomber was supposed to hit a top speed of 307 miles per hour. This speed was calculated at an operating altitude of 25,000 feet. At the same time, it could carry an impressive bomb load of up to 9,920 pounds. Unfortunately, the military was dealing with major budget cuts in those years. As a result, this ambitious project never actually got official government funding. But Boeing management was so convinced of the aircraft's potential that they made a bold call. They decided to keep working on the Model 322 entirely on the company's own dime. By late 1938, a new concept was born. This was the Boeing Model 333A. The plan was to power this formidable bomber with 4 12-cylinder, liquid-cooled Allison V1710 engines. They were designed to be mounted in pairs. Each engine pushed out 1,150 horsepower on takeoff. But this time around, they had to ditch the idea of a fully pressurized fuselage. The main reason was pretty practical. They needed to be able to freely open the bomb bay doors during high-altitude combat operations. Instead, the engineers proposed a brilliant compromise. This involved building separate pressurized cabins in the nose and midsection of the fuselage. These two zones were connected by a pressurized crawl tunnel. This setup allowed crew members to safely and freely move from one part of the bomber to another in flight. Interestingly, this unique design feature eventually became a signature trait of all subsequent long-range Boeing bombers. It soon became clear that the Allison V1710 engines struggled at high altitudes. So the decision was made to swap them out. They chose air-cooled radials from either Wright or Pratt & Whitney. These engines were much better suited for high-altitude flight. The updated and heavily revised design was ready by February 1939. It took on the new designation of Model 333B. This version was equipped with 4 Wright radials buried entirely within the thick wings. Its gross takeoff weight was 52,180 pounds. The bomber was expected to reach a top speed of 364 miles per hour at 20,000 feet. Carrying a standard 2,000-pound bomb load, the aircraft had an estimated range of about 2,500 miles. In March 1939, engineers unveiled an ambitious, entirely new design dubbed the Model 334. They significantly increased the wingspan, stretching it to 120 feet. This made room for more internal fuel. It bumped the maximum range up to an impressive 4,500 miles. Just like earlier concepts, they buried the Pratt & Whitney radials inside the thick wings. The aircraft featured a twin-tail design. This made it easier to mount machine guns and cannons in the rear. As a result, the gross weight of this giant reached 66,000 pounds. It also had a bomb capacity of up to 7,830 pounds. By July 1939, after carefully reviewing and revising the previous plans, an improved design was born. This was the Boeing Model 334A. This time, the engineers completely changed their approach. They dropped the buried engines and the twin tail. Instead, the new bomber was fitted with 4 conventional Wright R-3350 radials housed in external nacelles. The tail was swapped for a standard single vertical stabilizer. The aircraft also received a massive 135-foot-high mounted wing. What is really fascinating is this. Right at this stage, the design clearly began to show the legendary lines of the future B-29 Superfortress. Boeing paid for the construction of a full-scale mock-up with company funds. They completed it in December 1939. The estimated wing loading was 64 pounds per square foot. The massive bomber was designed for a crew of 12. According to the designers, it could deliver 2,000 pounds of bombs over a then colossal range of more than 5,000 miles. This capability made it a truly unprecedented weapon. Meanwhile, things were in full swing at the War Department too. Under direct orders from the Chief of the Army Air Corps, General Henry Hap Arnold, a special committee was formed. Headed by Brigadier General Walter G. Kilner, its main task was to figure out exactly what kind of combat aircraft the military would need in the near future. Interestingly, one of the key members of this committee was the famous aviator Charles Lindbergh. Not long before this, he had personally toured German aircraft factories and Luftwaffe bases. Because of this, he fully understood the scale of the looming threat. In June 1939, the Kilner Board strongly recommended immediately beginning development of new long-range medium and heavy bombers. Shortly after the outbreak of World War II in Europe, General Arnold made a proposal. On November 10, 1939, he proposed awarding contracts to major aviation companies. Their task was to build a very long-range bomber. By December 2nd, this proposal was officially approved. Following this, a group of technical officers began drafting the official specifications for the upcoming aircraft. They were led by Captain Donald Leander Putt at Wright Field. In January 1940, the Army issued its requirements for the new bomber. The specifications were highly demanding. They required a top speed of at least 400 miles per hour. The range had to be no less than 5,333 miles. Furthermore, the aircraft needed the ability to carry a minimum of 2,000 pounds of bombs over that entire distance. These parameters were formalized in official government documents. This included Data Request R-40B and Specification XC-218. In late January, the United States War Department circulated these documents to 4 aviation giants. These were Boeing, Consolidated, Douglas, and Lockheed. However, by April, the military had to urgently revise these requirements. They had to take into account early combat experience from the air war in Europe. The new aircraft would now require much heavier defensive armament. It also needed increased armor protection for the crew. Finally, it needed self-sealing fuel tanks that could sustain enemy fire. When Boeing received Data Request R-40B, they already had a significant head start over their competitors. Back in August 1939, Boeing engineers had begun work on a new design. This was the Model 341. This aircraft featured a highly advanced and aerodynamically refined wing design. This provided exceptional lift. The wingspan was 124 feet and 7 inches. According to initial performance estimates, the Model 341 could reach 405 miles per hour. This speed was achievable at an altitude of 25,000 feet. Powering this heavy bomber were four Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engines. Each engine produced 2,000 horsepower. The bomber had a gross takeoff weight of almost 86,000 pounds. It could fly 7,000 miles. During this flight, it could carry around 2,200 pounds of ordnance. For shorter range missions, the maximum bomb load could be increased to an impressive 10,000 pounds. To meet the revised requirements of the military, engineers had to heavily modify their existing design. This led to the development of the updated Boeing Model 345. This aircraft featured pressurized crew compartments. It was powered by the new and much more capable Wright R3350 engines. It was designed to accommodate a crew of 12. As with earlier concepts, it utilized a tricycle landing gear configuration with dual wheels on each strut. However, there was one major structural difference. The main gear struts no longer retracted into the wings. Instead, they folded directly into the engine nacelles. This significantly improved aerodynamic efficiency. The defensive armament of the bomber was formidable. It consisted of four retractable turrets. Each was armed with twin 50-caliber M2 Browning machine guns. The position of the tail gunner featured two more of the same machine guns. These were placed alongside a 20mm M2 cannon. Crucially, the gunners operated the retractable turrets remotely. They used an advanced periscopic sighting system for precise aiming. According to engineering projections, the Boeing Model 345 was capable of delivering 2,205 pounds of bombs. This was over a range of 5,333 miles. Cruising speed was estimated at 290 miles per hour. The maximum bomb load was expanded to 16,100 pounds. At an altitude of 25,000 feet, the aircraft was expected to reach 382 miles per hour. Its maximum gross takeoff weight was 97,700 pounds. The official presentation of this ambitious project to Army leadership took place on May 11, 1940. The military was highly impressed. By June 17th, the decision was made to grant Boeing the funding. This allowed them to further refine their concept and conduct wind tunnel tests. Shortly after, on June 27, 1940, the Army signed contracts with four leading aircraft companies. These were Boeing, Lockheed, Douglas, and Consolidated. Their task was to develop preliminary specifications for the future Superbomber. Based on the priorities of the military, these projects were designated as the XB-29, XB-30, XB-31, and XB-32, respectively. However, the competition did not last long. Lockheed and Douglas soon dropped out of the race without even finishing their preliminary designs. On August 24, 1940, the military awarded a contract specifically to Boeing. It called for the construction of two flying prototypes and one static test airframe. These were under the general designation XB-29. But what if the XB-29 did not pan out? To be safe, on September 6th, they signed a backup contract with Consolidated. This was to build two prototypes of their XB-32 design. Work at Boeing was well underway. By the end of November, engineers had prepared a full-scale mock-up of the future giant. After a thorough inspection on December 14th, Army representatives were so impressed that they ordered a third prototype. A second mock-up was completed in May 1941. As the prospect of entering the war became increasingly real, work on the B-29 project was given top priority. Soon after, an order was placed for a batch of 14 aircraft for service testing. These received the YB-29 designation. On May 17, 1941, the Army announced its intent to procure 250 of these bombers. To handle production on this scale, Boeing leased a massive government-owned plant in Wichita, Kansas. In September of that same year, this huge order was officially confirmed. Then came the tragic attack on Pearl Harbor and the United States entry into the war. Production requirements skyrocketed. So in February 1942, the order was doubled to 500 bombers. Yet even this was not enough. In March 1942, production goals were increased by over 1,000 additional aircraft. Realizing that a single company simply could not physically handle that kind of output, the Army Air Forces took action. They decided to leverage the manufacturing power of several industrial giants to build the B-29. Three major corporations joined the effort to build the new Superfortress. One was Bell Aircraft with its new plant in Marietta, Georgia. Another was North American Aviation with a facility in Kansas City, Missouri. The third was the Fisher Body Division of General Motors. Their plant was located in Cleveland, Ohio. This was an unprecedented move. Given the massive scale of orders for an aircraft that existed strictly on paper at the time, there was only one comparison. The only program that even compared to the B-29 was the B-26 Marauder. Soon after, production plans for the B-29 had to be revised. The decision was made to completely shift the North American Aviation plant in Kansas City over to producing B-25 Mitchell bombers. Instead, B-29 assembly was handed over to the Boeing plant in Renton, Washington. Interestingly enough, this facility was initially built with Navy funding. It was meant to produce the twin-engine Boeing PBB-1 Sea Ranger patrol flying boat. However, the Army and Navy worked out a mutually beneficial deal. The PBB-1 project was canceled, and the Renton plant was retooled to produce the B-29. In exchange, the Navy received the land-based B-25 Mitchell and B-24 Liberator bombers they needed from the Army. The changes did not stop there. The Fisher Body Division had to completely shift its focus to gear up for the production of the P-75 escort fighter. As a result, the Glenn L. Martin Company was brought into the massive B-29 production program. They were awarded a contract to assemble these giant bombers at a brand new government-owned plant in Omaha, Nebraska. It is worth noting that these facilities only handled the final assembly of the aircraft. The project was so massive that individual parts and entire subassemblies for the B-29 were supplied by a huge number of factories. These facilities were scattered all across the United States. American industrial giants like Chrysler, Hudson, Goodyear, Briggs, Murray, and Cessna all stepped up. They helped to build airframe components for this bomber. The initial design concept for the aircraft, known as Model 345, was an all-metal monoplane. Its high aspect ratio wing was mid-mounted on the fuselage. The fuselage featured a circular cross-section and a semi-monocoque design. This made the whole airframe both lightweight and incredibly strong. Engineers took a pretty creative approach to testing the wing. They built a quarter-scale model. Then they swapped out the standard wings on a small Fairchild PT-19A trainer. This allowed them to test the aerodynamics directly in flight. Since a massive bomber like this had such a heavy wing loading, the aircraft needed special flaps to safely reduce its speed for landing. To solve this, they used innovative Fowler flaps. When deployed, the wing area increased by a full 20%. This provided that crucial extra lift. The rear sections of the inboard engine nacelles purposely extended past the trailing edge of the wing. This extension actually improved the effectiveness of the flaps. As they continued to refine the design, engineers decided to slightly stretch the forward fuselage. This increased the overall length of the bomber. It went from 93 feet to 98 feet and 2 inches. On top of that, the glass nose was given a smoother, more rounded profile. The area of the vertical stabilizer was also significantly increased. This change was made to improve the heavy bomber's handling and directional stability. Another revolutionary feature of the Model 345 was its remote-controlled defensive gun system. Since the bomber was designed to operate at extreme high altitudes, it was impractical to put gunners directly inside the unpressurized turrets. The aircraft was equipped with 4 of these remote turrets. 2 were located on top of the fuselage, and 2 were on the belly. Each of them was armed with twin 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns. A 5th defensive position was located right in the tail of the aircraft. Here, unlike the remote turrets, a gunner actually sat directly inside the pressurized tail compartment. His arsenal consisted of 2 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns. He also had a single 20mm M2 Type B cannon. The competition to build this defensive system for the B-29 was incredibly fierce. Major defense contractors like Bendix, General Electric, Sperry, and Westinghouse all fought for the job. Sperry won the initial bid. Their engineers pitched a unique system featuring retractable turrets. In this setup, the gunners would aim at enemy fighters using a specialized periscope system. The bomb load was stowed inside the aircraft in 2 separate bomb bays. Each bay was equipped with its own set of doors. The bomb release was controlled by an automated device called an intervalometer. It dropped the munitions in an alternating sequence from the front and rear bays. This was a brilliant solution because it kept the weight evenly distributed. This balance helped the pilots maintain the bomber's center of gravity during an attack run. Powering the new Model 345 were four massive, 18-cylinder twin-row Wright R3350 duplex Cyclone air-cooled radial engines. Each of these monsters cranked out 2,200 horsepower for takeoff. The aircraft needed to avoid losing power even at extreme altitudes. These altitudes ranged up between 29,000 and 33,000 feet. To achieve this, engineers equipped each engine with two powerful General Electric B-11 turbochargers. The pilots did not have to manage them manually. This was thanks to an automated electronic control system from Minneapolis Honeywell. These engines drove massive three-blade propellers measuring a full 17 feet across. To make sure these props worked as efficiently as possible, they used a reduction gear. This meant that for every 100 revolutions of the crankshaft, the propeller itself turned just 35 times. The engine nacelles were highly streamlined to minimize drag. Furthermore, the engineers cleverly tucked the oil coolers and turbo intercoolers right inside the chin intakes under the engines. The Model 345 featured an all-metal airframe, with the only exceptions being the flight control surfaces. The ailerons, rudder, and elevators were traditionally fabric-covered to save weight and maintain balance. The bomber sat on tricycle landing gear. It featured a fully steerable nose wheel for easy taxiing. Each gear strut was fitted with dual wheels on a single axle. Instead of hydraulics, the landing gear was raised and lowered using powerful electric motors. Interestingly, the nose gear retracted backward into the fuselage. Meanwhile, the main gear folded forward directly into the engine nacelles. To handle the massive weight on touchdown, the landing gear utilized heavy-duty oleo struts and effective hydraulic brakes. For added safety, engineers included a retractable tail skid. This protected the rear fuselage from an accidental tail strike on the runway. Operating a heavy bomber of this size took quite a crew. A typical crew had 12 men. However, that number could range from 10 to 14. The standard lineup included the aircraft commander, a co-pilot, navigator, and bombardier. It also included a flight engineer, radio operator, and radar operator. 5 aerial gunners were responsible for defending the bomber. The bombardier had the best seat in the house. He was stationed right up in the glass nose with his bomb sight. Just behind him, sitting side by side, were the aircraft commander and the co-pilot. Their stations were heavily protected by thick armor plating and bulletproof glass. Further aft in the flight deck worked the flight engineer, radio operator, and navigator. The crew accessed this forward pressurized cabin through a hatch inside the nose gear wheel well. In the rear section of the aircraft, behind a sturdy armored bulkhead, sat 4 of the gunners and the radar operator. The tail gunner, however, was completely isolated in his own separate pressurized compartment. While the aircraft was pressurized, there was no physical way for him to move forward. He could not join his crewmates in the aft section. The rear crew boarded through a dedicated door on the right side of the fuselage. The B-29 prototype made its historic first flight on September 21, 1942. It took to the skies from Boeing Field. At the controls of this behemoth was the renowned Boeing test pilot Edmund "Eddie" Allen. Interestingly, the rival prototype, the B-32, had taken to the air from Lindbergh Field. This happened just a couple of weeks earlier on September 7th, but the race had already been decided. By that time, the government had already put its full faith in Boeing. They placed a massive order for 1,664 B-29s right off the drawing board. Meanwhile, their competitor had not locked in a single production order yet. Initially, the very first B-29 was completely unarmed. They used it to test the R33-5012 engines with those same 17-foot propellers. But during these tests, a critical problem emerged. The engines had a notorious tendency to overheat and catch fire in midair. Unfortunately, engineers never fully resolved this issue. To put the scale of the problem into perspective, consider this. By December 1942, over the course of 23 flights, Allen had logged a total of only 27 hours in the air. In that short amount of time, mechanics had to replace 16 failed engines, 19 exhaust systems, and 22 carburetors. On top of that, the supercharger regulators were constantly acting up. On December 28, 1942, during another test flight, one of the engines caught fire. Edmund Allen had to rely on all his skill to execute an emergency landing and save the aircraft. But despite these constant power plant issues, the B-29 itself handled perfectly in the air. It was a real pleasure to fly. The bomber's aerodynamics and overall design were so successful that they required almost no modifications. That is exactly why this very first B-29 prototype remained with the developers. It served as a reliable flying testbed for various experiments right up until the end of the war. The second B-29 prototype took to the skies for its maiden flight on December 30th, 1942. However, the debut flight was cut short. A sudden engine fire forced the crew to make an immediate landing. All further testing was halted to completely replace the power plants. The aircraft was temporarily equipped with engines salvaged from the first prototype. On February 18, 1943, the second B-29 took to the air once again. At the controls was veteran test pilot Edmund "Eddie" Allen. But just 8 minutes into the flight, an engine caught fire yet again. Allen made a split-second decision to return to Boeing Field immediately. Sadly, the wing structure could not withstand the extreme heat of the fire. It began to fail in mid-air. Unable to reach the safety of the runway, the heavy bomber crashed into the Fry meat packing plant. The horrific crash claimed the lives of the entire crew, including Eddie Allen himself, as well as 18 factory workers on the ground. As a tribute, a later production B-29 was funded by donations from Boeing workers in Wichita. It was christened the Eddie Allen. This memorial aircraft flew 24 combat missions from bases in the Mariana Islands. During its final mission, it took severe damage. It made a forced landing on a small Pacific island where it was eventually cannibalized for parts. The tragic loss of the prototype had serious fallout at the highest levels of government. President Franklin D. Roosevelt personally ordered the creation of an investigative committee. Its primary objective was to determine what was delaying the entire B-29 development program. It also looked into delays of several other major military projects. Under the original timeline, these new bombers were supposed to be deployed to air bases in India before the end of 1943. The special committee to investigate the National Defense Program, chaired by Senator Harry Truman, took on the case. During its investigations, the committee frequently uncovered price gouging across various types of military hardware. But when the senators took a close look at the B-29 program, they came to a clear-cut conclusion. The main bottleneck was the Wright Aeronautical Company. It had been delivering defective or substandard aircraft engines. However, a fair share of the blame was also placed on the U.S. Army Air Force's high command. Military brass had been constantly pressuring the company engineers to rush the delivery of the new engines. This inevitably took a severe toll on their reliability. Despite these setbacks, by June 1943, Boeing engineers had completed the third prototype of the aircraft. This time, the designers learned from their previous mistakes. The bomber was fitted with heavily upgraded engines and updated internal systems. To accelerate the start of mass production for future B-29s, this test aircraft was sent straight to the Boeing plant in Wichita, Kansas. There, engineers and line workers gained hands-on experience to tool up the assembly line. Once the factory phase was completed, the airplane was officially handed over to U.S. military test pilots. They put it through its paces in extensive flight testing. Unfortunately, this prototype met a tragic end as well. It was later completely destroyed in a crash. The next major step was building a pre-production batch of aircraft specifically for operational testing. All 14 of these bombers were successfully assembled at that same Boeing plant in Kansas. This pre-production variant was given the official designation YB-29. The first of these aircraft officially rolled off the Wichita assembly line on April 15, 1943. It made its maiden flight by early summer on June 26th. To get this massive aircraft off the ground, it relied on 4 powerful Wright R-3350 radial engines, each driving large 3-bladed propellers. Parallel to production, the Army Air Forces started forming the combat units to fly them. On June 1, 1943, in Marietta, Georgia, the first combat unit slated to receive the new B-29 was officially activated. This unit was designated as the 58th Bombardment Wing. By July of that same year, the military had taken delivery of the first 7 pre-production YB-29s. At first, they were assigned strictly to training bases. This allowed future crews to safely learn the ropes of what was, at the time, a truly revolutionary bomber. Back then, periscope-sighted retractable gun turrets were already being fitted onto bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress, B-24 Liberator, and B-25 Mitchell. However, in real combat conditions, aiming through a periscope proved highly impractical. Because of this, frontline mechanics often just removed the systems entirely. When the Sperry Corporation tested its retractable periscope turrets on the first 3 XB-29 prototypes, the military was dissatisfied. They ultimately canceled the contract. Instead, they brought in General Electric to get the job done. Their solution was different. The turrets no longer retracted into the fuselage. Also, aiming became remote. This was thanks to a cutting-edge analog computer fire control system. In total, the bomber featured 5 firing positions. There were 2 upper, 2 lower, and 1 in the tail. Each of these was armed with twin 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns. They carried 500 rounds per gun. Back in the tail, however, alongside the machine guns, sat a powerful 20mm M2 cannon. This cannon had 100 rounds of ammo. The gunners controlled the fire from remote sighting stations. 4 of these stations were set up inside the aircraft. 1 was up front near the bombardier, and 3 were in the rear pressurized compartment. Only the tail gunner was physically stationed immediately adjacent to his guns. All 4 remote gunners were equipped with advanced gyroscopic sights. These essentially functioned as analog computers. These devices were the heart of the entire electronic fire control system. To range and track a target, the gunner simply operated 2 round knobs on the sides of the sight. The way the system worked was pretty fascinating. Through a series of lenses, an internal bulb projected a bright ring of dots. This ring had a center pipper directly onto the sight glass. Over on the right was a dial calibrated for different types of enemy aircraft. By rolling this thumb wheel, the gunner adjusted the size of that illuminated ring. This matched the wingspan of a specific enemy fighter. Then came the real magic of 1940s technology. The gunner only needed to track the enemy aircraft in his sight for a single second. In that brief moment, the automated system measured angular velocity and analyzed course changes. It also calculated target range. It figured out the exact deflection lead for the shot all on its own. Once the enemy fighter's wingtips touched the edges of the illuminated ring, all the gunner had to do was squeeze the trigger. The system took care of the rest. Crew duties during combat were carefully delegated. The bombardier typically controlled the forward upper turret. The aft upper and both lower turrets were controlled by 3 gunners. They were stationed back in the rear pressurized cabin. But there was a fascinating part thanks to this advanced electronic system. Any gunner except the tail gunner could control and fire 2 turrets at the exact same time. The nerve center of this defense system was the central fire control gunner in the aft cabin. His seat was raised slightly higher than the others. This gave him the best possible view of the surrounding airspace from his upper blister. Right in front of him sat a master control panel loaded with toggle switches. Assessing the tactical situation in the air, he acted like an orchestra conductor. He flipped switches to hand off turret control to the other gunners depending on where the enemy attacks were coming from. The only exception was the tail turret. This could only be fired by the tail gunner stationed directly behind it. Bringing in this automated system from General Electric had another major advantage. It allowed the bomber crew size to be reduced to 11 men. This tight-knit team included the pilot, who served as the aircraft commander. It also included the co-pilot, the bombardier, the navigator, and the flight engineer. The radio operator and the radar operator completed the team. Along with them were the central fire control gunner, the left and right blister gunners, and the tail gunner. This new weapon system was first put to the test on the 3rd experimental XB-29. But innovation came at a price. Unlike the older gear from Sperry, the General Electric system turned out to be an absolute power hog. To keep it powered, engineers had to pack several extra high-output generators into the aircraft. These modifications, combined with a whole slew of other technical tweaks, did not come without consequences. They caused yet another delay right before the start of mass production for the B-29. They also added a massive amount of weight to the aircraft. This bumped its total gross weight to well over 105,000 pounds. During operational testing, the original 3-blade propellers were replaced with more efficient 4-blade Hamilton Standard units. One of the first experimental YB-29 aircraft was handed over to General Motors. There, it was fitted with new liquid-cooled Allison V-3420 engines for extensive comparative testing. After this modification, the bomber received a new designation, the XB-39. Essentially, the new engine was a clever combination of two 12-cylinder Allison V-1710 engines. They were geared together to turn a single large propeller. This powerful setup delivered 2,100 horsepower at an altitude of 25,000 feet. Thanks to this change, the aircraft top speed increased to 405 miles per hour at 35,000 feet. However, even this performance boost was not enough to justify disrupting the assembly lines to put the upgraded version into mass production. Designers used another YB-29 as a flying testbed for various defensive weapon setups. In its nose section, they mounted an Airco ball turret armed with twin 50-caliber machine guns. Additionally, special blisters were installed on both sides of the forward fuselage. Each housed two more 50-caliber guns. As an experiment, yet another YB-29 was equipped with an even heavier arsenal. This included manned ball turrets on the top and bottom of the fuselage. It also featured extra waist gunner positions where the fuselage narrowed toward the tail, and a remote-controlled nose turret that was truly ahead of its time. The most widely produced and recognizable version of the legendary Superfortress was the standard Boeing B-29. In total, factories built 2,513 of these heavy bombers. Production was split among several facilities. 1,620 aircraft were assembled at the main Boeing plant in Wichita, Kansas. Another 536 bombers rolled off the assembly line at the Martin plant in Omaha, Nebraska. Meanwhile, the remaining 357 units were built by Bell at their facility in Marietta, Georgia. The main visual and technical difference between the production B-29s and earlier prototypes was the use of massive four-blade propellers. They measured 16 feet 7 inches in diameter. They also featured full feathering capability. This allowed the crew to significantly reduce drag in the event of an engine failure. At the heart of these aircraft were the powerful Wright R-3350 engines. At war emergency power, they could deliver an impressive 2,300 horsepower. The very first bombers that rolled out of the Wichita plant were painted in the standard United States Army Air Forces camouflage. They were painted olive drab on top and neutral gray on the bottom, with a blended transition line. However, this scheme was quickly abandoned. All subsequent aircraft were sent to the front lines unpainted, gleaming in a bare metal finish. The first production B-29s began rolling off the Boeing assembly lines in Kansas in September 1943. A few months later, in February 1944, the Bell facility in Marietta joined the production effort. By mid-1944, the Martin plant rolled out its first aircraft as well. At the same time, an entirely new Boeing facility in Renton, Washington, focused exclusively on producing a slightly upgraded version of the bomber. This version was designated the B-29A. Typically, a B-29 carried a crew of 11. The crew consisted of the aircraft commander, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, flight engineer, radio operator, and radar operator. In the air, the bomber was defended by the central fire control gunner, left and right blister gunners, and the tail gunner. The pilots, bombardier, navigator, flight engineer, and radio operator all worked in the forward pressurized compartment. Meanwhile, the radar operator and the 3 gunners were stationed in the aft pressurized compartment. To allow the crew to move between these compartments at high altitude, they were connected by a pressurized crawl tunnel. This tunnel was about 3 feet in diameter and ran directly over the bomb bays. The tail gunner, however, sat in his own isolated pressurized compartment. This meant he could not reach the rest of the crew while at altitude. Later in the war, during combat operations, they began carrying 2 extra specialists. These specialists handled electronic countermeasures against enemy radar and radio. On those missions, the B-29 crew grew to 13 men. To feed its thirsty engines, the aircraft required massive amounts of fuel, specifically 100-octane avgas. The fuel system was a complex network. 14 tanks were housed in the outer wing panels. 8 more sat in the wing center section. 4 extra tanks could be mounted inside the bomb bays. Altogether, this system held a massive 8,168 gallons of fuel. But for ultra-long-range missions, even that was not enough. So in an early production modification, they added 4 more tanks to the wing center section. This bumped the total fuel capacity to an incredible 9,438 gallons. Early versions of the B-29 were equipped with the Philco-Loran navigation system. Later on, to make navigation more accurate, it was swapped out for a more advanced system made by RCA. On top of that, the aircraft were fitted with a multi-purpose radar. The crew could use it not just for precision bombing, but also for navigation on long missions. This system was developed by Bell Telephone Laboratories in partnership with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Mass production was handled by Western Electric. To avoid compromising the bomber aerodynamics, the radar antenna was housed inside a special retractable hemispherical radome. It measured 30 inches in diameter. This unit could be lowered into the airstream. It was positioned right between the two bomb bays. Over time, they began equipping the aircraft with an even more powerful radar. This was known as the Eagle system. Its antenna was mounted differently. It sat inside an airfoil-shaped radome. This radome was attached to the lower forward section of the fuselage. Just like the previous model, the Eagle radar was designed by Bell Telephone and built by Western Electric. While mass production was in full swing, designers were constantly tweaking and improving the aircraft. Because of this, the B-29 went through numerous modifications and block upgrades. Early combat operations exposed a major vulnerability. The bomber lacked adequate defensive firepower against head-on attacks from enemy fighters. The Army Air Forces reacted quickly. At the Boeing Wichita plant, they beefed up the forward upper turret. They upgraded it to house 4 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns. Soon after, the other production facilities adopted this crucial upgrade. For instance, the Bell Atlanta plant started installing the 4-gun turrets on their subsequent production blocks. Meanwhile, the Martin plant made this heavier firepower standard on every bomber rolling off their line. If you look back at the early versions of the B-29, their maximum fuel capacity was 8,168 gallons. But for those ultra-long-range missions, that just was not going to cut it. So engineers at the Wichita plant increased the tank capacity. This allowed the aircraft to take on 9,438 gallons of aviation fuel. A little later down the line, the Bell plant started installing these same larger tanks. Meanwhile, the bombers rolling off the Martin assembly line boasted extra wing tanks right from the get-go. This gave them a massive advantage in range. Later on, the bombers coming out of Wichita got another major upgrade. They received the new, more powerful R-33-5041 engines. This modification featured updated exhaust systems and enlarged oil passages. The engineers did this specifically to tackle the notorious overheating issues. It also seriously improved engine cooling under heavy workloads. Martin and Bell also saw the value in this design. They soon started dropping these engines into their own bombers across the board. Back in the tail section of the aircraft, an unexpected weapons issue popped up. It turned out that the trajectory of the shells from the 20mm cannon was completely different from the ballistics of the 50 caliber machine guns. Because of this difference, it was incredibly tough for the tail gunners to effectively fire both weapons at the same time. This was especially true in the heat of combat. To make things easier for the crew, the Wichita plant simply stopped installing those cannons altogether. It was not long before the other plants followed suit. Both Bell and Martin dropped the heavy cannon from their production lines too. And by the later stages of production, all 3 manufacturers transitioned to an even more advanced engine. This was the R-33-5057. It gave the bombers absolutely stellar flight performance. Early on, the military had some serious doubts about whether the remote-controlled defensive armament was actually going to be reliable. Because of this hesitation, they ran an experiment. They retrofitted one B-29 the old-fashioned way, fitting it with classic manned turrets where the gunner actually sat inside. This one-off aircraft was equipped with 2 upper power turrets and 2 lower ball turrets. They packed each of those turrets with a pair of trusty M2 Browning 50 caliber machine guns. On top of that, they mounted 2 more of those same guns in blister windows on both sides of the forward fuselage. They also added a couple of waist guns to protect the flanks of the aircraft. But real-world testing quickly settled the debate. The remote fire control system proved to be absolutely superior when it came to both accuracy and crew safety. This meant this experimental manned turret setup was never used again. The era of mass-producing these iconic bombers slowly started winding down toward the end of World War II. the final B-29 rolled off the Boeing assembly line in Wichita in October 1945. Bell actually wrapped up assembly on their last standard B-29 even earlier, in January 1945. After that, they completely shifted their factory output over to the upgraded B-29B variant. Meanwhile, the Martin plant in Omaha rolled out its final aircraft of this legendary production run in September 1945. Combat experience with the early B-29 heavy bombers in the war against Japan prompted designers to seriously revamp the aircraft. To make the bomber more effective, it was equipped with a simplified defensive armament system. Bell Aircraft took on production for this upgraded variant. The actual assembly took place at a massive plant in Marietta, Georgia. This facility is owned by Lockheed today. In total, over 300 of these aircraft rolled off the assembly line, officially designated as the B-29B. Soon, these brand new bombers joined a bomb wing specializing in grueling night raids on vital industrial targets across the Japanese Empire. Interestingly, from February to May 1945, the completed aircraft were first flown to a special arsenal in Oklahoma. There, they were fitted with highly classified electronic equipment. But starting in May of that same year, the Marietta plant streamlined its production line so well that it began shipping fully equipped, combat-ready bombers directly to frontline units. The B-29B variant also featured several other important design changes that set it apart from its predecessors. For example, engineers reshaped the engine cowlings and installed new aerodynamic fairings for the turbochargers. Manual engine controls were largely phased out. This left the process entirely up to reliable automated systems. To shed as much weight as possible from the bomber, they ruthlessly stripped out a ton of heavy electronic equipment. This gear was complex but practically useless in actual combat. They removed old radio altimeters, bulky transmitters, liaison radios, extra antennas with their cables, and outdated radar systems. Even the static dischargers got a new, significantly more aerodynamic shape. The main goal of the designers was to strip the aircraft of anything that did not contribute directly to its combat mission. This approach drastically reduced its overall weight. A whole host of items were removed. This ranged from signal devices and warning lights to the crew bunks. They also removed the oxygen supply system for the tail gunner. Extra seat belts at auxiliary crew stations and the desk for the bombardier were removed. Furthermore, optical instruments and boxes of electrical schematics were taken out. An extra camera and even the pneumatic desing boots on the wings and tail surfaces were removed. However, the most radical changes were made to the armament and armor. These were stripped down to an absolute minimum. Designers completely removed both the upper and lower fuselage machine gun turrets. They deleted the complicated remote fire control system and removed the heavy 20mm cannon. The heavy armor plating was also almost entirely eliminated. They only kept the armored glass in front of the pilot seats and the sturdy ballistic glass in the tail gunner's compartment. Protective flak curtains were taken out as well. This left only a solid duralumin backing plate right behind the pilots. All the openings left by the removed turrets and sighting blisters were neatly faired over with flush metal panels. Instead, a third 50 caliber machine gun was added to the tail turret. Additionally, special windows were built into the rear fuselage. This allowed the crew to return fire with manually operated machine guns in case of a sudden threat. To make up for the lack of armor, the tail gunner's position was equipped with a modern radar gun sight. It also received an identification friend or foe system called Ella. Thanks to the new radar, the crew could detect enemy fighters approaching from the rear at a much greater range. The upgraded B-29B bombers also received the then brand new Eagle radar. This advanced system was developed by the engineers over at MIT's Radiation Laboratory. Interestingly, this radar did not see a whole lot of action in the European theater. It was only installed on a few hundred B-17s and a couple dozen B-24s. Even though the Eagle radar only had a 60-degree field of view, it made up for it with incredibly high resolution. The antenna itself looked a bit like a small wing mounted right under the fuselage. It was placed dead center between the forward and aft bomb bays. Because of this new gear, the radar operator station was moved from the aft pressurized compartment up to the front. This put it closer to the flight deck. At the same time, they decided to ditch the extra radar scope at the navigator station. Since the Eagle system drew a lot of power, the airplane had to be retrofitted. It received a new power bus and two heavy-duty inverters. But there was a major advantage. Thanks to a special adapter, the crew could link this advanced radar directly to the famous Norden bomb site. This made bombing incredibly accurate, even in poor weather conditions. The demand for these new B-29B bombers was so high that the first aircraft were sent to combat units before they were even fully equipped. Because they were in such a rush, they did not even have time to install the radars or IFF systems. They also left out the fire control computers and the upgraded tailguns. Despite this, the bombers started flying combat missions with the 16th and 501st Bombardment Groups. These units reached full combat readiness by April 1, 1945. Exactly 1 month later, on May 1st, 2 more groups joined the air offensive. Interestingly, the operators for the new Eagle radars initially trained on a different aircraft. They used specifically modified B-24 bombers. It was only after World War II ended that the rest of the B-29 fleet was fully equipped with these radars. Back in 1944, the Army Air Forces had some massive plans. Once production of the legendary B-17 completely wrapped up in Seattle, they planned to launch full-scale production of a new variant. This was the B-29C. The initial order was staggering. They planned to build 5,000 of these bombers. However, the war ended. Because of this, the massive contract simply had to be canceled. The final variant in this family was the B-29D. It was built at the Renton plant. Shortly after, the military redesignated the aircraft as the B-50A. Altogether, a total of 3,627 aircraft across all main variants were assembled at aviation plants across the United States. This included the experimental XB-29s and YB-29s. It also included the production B-29, B-29A, and B-29B models. When discussing the various versions of the B-29, we cannot forget the export variant that proudly served with the British Royal Air Force. In the early 1950s, the RAF desperately needed a capable modern bomber. They needed a reliable stopgap to replace their aging Avro Lincolns. This temporary solution was required until the new English electric Canberra jet bombers could enter service. An official agreement between the UK and the US was signed on January 27, 1950. Under this agreement, the Americans transferred 70 B-29s to their British allies. Later on, the UK received another 18 airframes. In RAF service, this American heavy bomber was officially redesignated as the Boeing Washington. The first 4 Washingtons landed at RAF Marham on March 22, 1950. This flight was not exactly uneventful. While crossing the Atlantic, one of the bombers lost an engine due to a sudden drop in oil pressure. The crew had to rely on some serious airmanship to pull off a safe emergency landing. Eventually, a dedicated training center for British pilots was set up at RAF Marham. It was actively supported by a mobile training unit from the U.S. Air Force. All the B-29s earmarked for Britain were ferried across the Atlantic by experienced American crews. The first British unit to completely transition to the Washington bombers was the 115th Squadron. Their pilots actually began their flight training back in the States. They then made a triumphant return to England in June 1950. Soon after, a number of other squadrons joined them. These units were stationed at RAF Marham and RAF Coningsby. However, the service life of these piston engine giants in England was relatively short. As early as 1953 and 1954, British aviation units began transitioning en masse to the brand new Canberra jets. The good old Washingtons served the longest, with the 192nd Squadron at RAF Watton. There, they kept flying right up until February 1958. During their time in service, the British Washingtons took part in countless large-scale military exercises. In particular, they regularly flew practice missions over bombing ranges in occupied Germany. British crews spoke very highly of these aircraft. Pilots especially loved the much higher level of comfort in the pressurized cabins. This was a massive improvement compared to the older British-built bombers. But the era of the piston engine bomber was rapidly coming to an end. After their service with the Royal Air Force officially concluded, all of these airplanes were flown back to the United States. There, they met a sad fate and were sent to the scrapyard. Combat operations of the B-29. The U.S. Navy had plenty of transport vessels to successfully land troops on Japanese soil. The Army also had all the necessary forces to pull it off. But the arrival of the new B-29 heavy bombers made this massive invasion simply unnecessary. That is exactly how the famous American general Jimmy Doolittle once described the situation. In November 1943, General Henry Hap Arnold gave a major order. He ordered the establishment of the 20th Bomber Command. The sole mission of this unit was to prepare for and carry out devastating airstrikes against the Japanese Empire. Brigadier General Kenneth B. Wolfe was put in charge of this powerful formation. The command consisted of 2 bomb wings. Each wing was made up of 4 bomb groups. The 58th Bomb Wing was led by Colonel Leonard Harmon. Meanwhile, the 73rd was commanded by Colonel Thomas H. Chapman. Command headquarters was set up at Smoky Hill Army Airfield in Kansas. This base was located right next to the massive Boeing plant in Wichita. On top of that, the military also took over a few neighboring airfields in Kansas. These included Pratt, Great Bend, and Walker. During this early phase, the command faced a critical task. They had to get the crews fully trained for upcoming combat as quickly and thoroughly as possible. Colonel Laverne George Saunders took charge of the pilot training program. Initially, they tried to fill the severe manpower shortage with volunteers. These volunteers had previously flown B-24s. They had just rotated back to the United States after heavy combat in Europe and North Africa. But even these seasoned veterans needed extensive transition training. The reality was that the new B-29 was far more technically complex. Its cutting-edge equipment demanded an entirely different skill set. On top of that, there was a massive shortage of the aircraft themselves. Because of this, many crews actually had to train on older B-17s. Training progressed painfully slowly. By the end of December 1943, only 67 pilots had managed to complete the full B-29 transition course. There were also major issues with the bombers themselves as they entered service. 97 brand new B-29s rolled off the assembly line by mid-January 1944. Out of those, only 16 were actually combat ready. The Wright R-3350 radial engines suffered from chronic breakdowns and fires. The radar units and General Electric remote-controlled gun turrets were also notoriously unreliable. Things got so bad that brand new aircraft were pulled right off the assembly line. They were then immediately sent to modification centers. Despite all these setbacks, Army Air Forces brass issued a strict ultimatum. The command was ordered to have exactly 150 combat-ready B-29s prepped for the 20th Bomber Command. This had to be completed by mid-April 1944. To meet that deadline, several thousand mechanics and engineers were mobilized. It turned into an around-the-clock frenzy, but through a monumental effort, they actually pulled it off. The first fully equipped B-29 squadrons were finally ready to deploy to the Far East. But before General Wolfe's armada set out for India, one experimental YB-29 flew a highly classified mission. Its main goal was to trick and confuse German and Japanese intelligence. This bomber made a direct, non-stop flight across the Atlantic. It flew from Gander Field straight to Great Britain. The plan worked flawlessly. Just 45 minutes after touching down, the Superfortress was photographed by a passing German recon plane. For the Germans, the sudden appearance of a new heavy strategic bomber in Britain could only mean one thing. The Americans were gearing up for a massive air campaign right there in Europe. At the same time, American intelligence intentionally leaked a rumor. They spread the story that this new design was actually a huge failure and had not met military expectations. They added that these airframes were now going to be used strictly as standard cargo transports. This set the stage for the massive campaign known as Operation Matterhorn. It involved intense combat missions flown out of forward air bases in India and China. These operations ran from June 1944 right through to March 1945. In the second half of April 1944, the 58th Bombardment Wing started its deployment to India. It was a grueling ferry route stretching over 11,500 miles. Starting in the United States, it crossed the Atlantic and then the Indian Ocean. It included short refueling stops in Marrakech, Morocco, and Cairo, Egypt. From there, the aircraft flew over the subcontinent. They had a stopover in Karachi. They finally touched down at the end of this incredible journey in Calcutta, India. But during this massive ferry flight, some new, incredibly serious technical problems started popping up. The week of April 15th to the 22nd proved to be the most tragic and difficult. During that time, 5 brand-new B-29 bombers went down in quick succession over Karachi. Investigators found that the massive Wright R-3350 engines were completely ill-suited for operating in a hot climate. This was especially true with air temperatures hitting 113 degrees Fahrenheit. The top engineers at Wright had to fix this critical flaw on the fly, right there in the field. Mechanics discovered a nightmare scenario. The exhaust valves on the rear cylinder bank were actually melting from the extreme heat. They managed to partially solve the problem through a few design tweaks. Engineers significantly boosted the cooling airflow over the cylinder heads. They also increased the oil flow to the hottest parts of the engine. Aside from these technical modifications, crews were strictly forbidden from taking off or landing during the heat of the day. Due to these unexpected delays and modifications, the massive bomber fleet was grounded. They were sitting idle until May 8, 1944. Out of the 148 aircraft that successfully made it to Marrakesh, only 130 actually arrived in India. These heavy bombers were stationed across 4 air bases just west of Calcutta. The headquarters of the 58th Bomb Wing and a few squadrons from the 40th Bomb Group set up shop at Chakalia Airfield. Meanwhile, the 444th Bomb Group made Chera Airfield their new home base. The 462nd Bomb Group flew into Piardoba, while the 468th arrived at Kharagpur. A short time later, the main headquarters of the 20th Bomber Command moved there as well. It is worth noting that all these bases were originally built back in 1942 and 1943 for a completely different bomber. That was the B-24. To safely handle the brand new and significantly larger B-29s, they had to urgently extend the runways. The length was increased from 6,000 to 7,200 feet. But by the time the first aircraft started arriving, construction was still underway. The runways were still too short. Because of this, the crews simply could not take off with a full bomb load. Some units, like the 444th Bomb Group, were only stationed at Chera temporarily. They waited there for their dedicated airfield to be finished over in Dudkundi. It was not until May 1944 that they were finally able to move to their permanent base. After that, Chera Airfield was used exclusively for incoming transport aircraft. These included planes like the consolidated C-87 and the Curtiss C-46 Commando. They brought in supplies for the 20th Bomber Command. On April 24, 1944, American General Wolfe and Colonel Saunders made that historic first flight over the rugged Himalayas. Colonel Saunders had just taken over for Colonel Harmon as commander of the 58th Bomb Wing. They flew from India into China. Their goal was to personally inspect the forward air bases around the Chengdu area. The groundwork for these sites had actually kicked off back in November 1943. This took place in the Chinese districts of Guanghan, Xinjiang, and Pengshan, specifically to handle the massive B-29s. The sheer scale of the construction was absolutely mind-boggling. This was especially true since almost all the work was done entirely by hand. By January 1944, an unbelievable number of people were drafted into building these airfields. There were roughly 200,000 Chinese laborers. This massive operation was overseen by just a small handful of American engineers. They had only the bare minimum of heavy equipment to work with. This machinery had been flown over the Himalayas on transport aircraft with incredible effort. But despite all the odds, by May 1, 1944, these Chinese bases were finally ready. Even though they were still under construction, they were prepared to receive the mighty B-29 bombers. But the real logistical nightmare was getting ammo and fuel to those forward bases in China. From there, the B-29s could finally reach Japanese airspace. To solve the fuel shortage, the Americans did something unconventional. They converted several B-29s into dedicated flying tankers. They stripped almost all the guns, leaving only the tail turret. They also installed massive tanks and a transfer system right inside the bomb bays. In this configuration, a single B-29 could haul over 15,000 pounds of high-octane avgas all the way to Chengdu. But the logistical cost of this setup was astronomical. Even in perfect weather, just to deliver 1 gallon of avgas to the base, the tanker burned 2 gallons of its own fuel. And if they hit a strong headwind, that ratio skyrocketed. It cost an unbelievable 12 gallons burned in flight for every single gallon delivered. High Command, specifically General Hap Arnold, was pushing General Wolfe hard. He wanted to launch the first combat mission over Japan by May 1st, 1944. But reality got in the way. By that deadline, they had only managed to move a little over 3 million pounds of cargo into the Chengdu bases. This fell critically short of what they needed for full-scale combat operations. On top of that, Japanese intelligence was paying attention. Once they caught wind of the American plans, they took action. On April 19, 1944, Japanese forces launched a massive offensive in China. It was codenamed Operation Ichigo. Their main objective was capturing the American airfields around Guilin and Liuzhou. However, Japanese high command seriously miscalculated by underestimating the incredible range of the new B-29. They never anticipated that these bombers could operate effectively from bases much deeper inland. As for the airfields at Guilin and Liuzhou, the Americans were prepping them for B-29s. But this was strictly as emergency divert fields. Meanwhile, back in Washington, they had stood up headquarters for the 20th Air Force. They reported directly to General Arnold. This newly created Air Force included the 20th Bomber Command. Their main mission was conducting strategic bombing against key targets on Formosa, which is modern-day Taiwan, as well as in Thailand and Burma. To beef up its striking power, on March 1, 1944, the newly formed 21st Bomber Command was also folded into the 20th Air Force. This set them up to play a major role in the air battles to come. On June 5, 1944, the 20th Air Force kicked off its first combat operation. A massive formation of 98 B-29 Superfortresses took to the skies from airfields in India. The crews had a tough mission ahead of them. Their target was the strategically vital Makassan rail yards near Bangkok, Thailand. This meant flying a route of about 1,130 miles. But the mission did not go according to plan. Right from the start, 14 bombers were forced to abort and turn back. This was mostly due to technical failures and engine problems. The original plan called for the B-29s to approach the target in tight four-ship formations. This would create a diamond pattern in the sky. But the American crews just could not maintain this complex formation. By the time the bombers reached the target area, they ran into heavy cloud cover. This forced the crews to bomb blind, relying exclusively on their radar. The combat formation completely broke down. The aircraft scattered to altitudes anywhere from 17,000 to 27,000 feet. They were supposed to stay tightly packed in their assigned altitude block between 22,000 and 25,000 feet. The effectiveness of the strike was virtually zero. Only 18 bombs actually hit the target. The flight back was just as much of an ordeal. 5 bombers crashed on landing. Another 42 aircraft had to divert to alternate airfields because they were running out of fuel. Overall, the results of this first mission were a total disappointment. The 20th Air Force's next move was a bold strike directly against the Japanese homeland. This carried huge symbolic weight for the Americans. It was the first large-scale attack on the home islands since Jimmy Doolittle's legendary raid back in April 1942. This time around, the primary target was a massive steel plant in the city of Yawata on the island of Kyushu. According to intelligence estimates, this facility was the beating heart of the Japanese war machine. It was churning out about a quarter of the empire's steel. Preparing for the strike was grueling. Just ferrying the aviation fuel to the forward operating bases in China took 2 whole weeks. The operation was set for June 14, 1944, but once again, mechanical issues got in the way. Out of the 75 bombers scheduled for the mission, 18 failed to launch due to maintenance problems and inexperienced crews. Meanwhile, another B-29 crashed on takeoff. To minimize the threat of Japanese fighters, command opted for a night attack. However, the outcome was once again disastrous. It was a complete failure. Only a single bomb actually landed in the target area, and even that one detonated almost 3/4 of a mile away from the aim point. The Americans lost several aircraft during the mission. 1 B-29 was shot down by flak, and 6 more bombers were lost to engine fires. That day, 55 American airmen lost their lives. Still, despite being a clear military failure, the raid had an unexpected silver lining. It provided a massive morale boost for the Chinese laborers building the airfields. They finally got to see with their own eyes that their backbreaking work was paying off. Following such a botched strike on Yawata, the top brass started demanding decisive action. General Henry Hap Arnold ordered the operations commander, General Kenneth Wolfe, to immediately step up the bombing campaign. But the logistical situation was still critical. At that point, aviation fuel reserves at the Chengdu bases stood at a mere 8,000 gallons. Given the reality on the ground, General Wolfe flat out stated that pulling off another large-scale raid anytime soon was physically impossible. High command did not want to hear it. Wolfe was immediately recalled to Washington. On July 4th, a new commander, General Laverne Saunders, took over the operation. The new commander did not waste any time. On July 7, 1944, General Laverne Saunders launched another raid on the Japanese island of Kyushu. This time, a modest force of 18 bombers struck targets in Sasebo, Nagasaki, Omura, and once again, Yawata. The primary goal for American air power remained the systematic destruction of the Japanese Empire's steel industry. Next on the target list was a huge industrial plant in Anshan over in Manchuria. The original, ambitious plan called for a daylight attack involving 100 heavy bombers. But reality intervened once again. The number of aircraft had to be cut down to 72, and only 60 of those actually made it to the target. This time around, American crews managed to start a massive fire at a major blast furnace. The brass was quick to label the mission a total success. But when intelligence analysts got a good look at the fresh aerial recon photos, it turned out the actual damage only covered about 7.5% of the sprawling complex. American losses stood at 6 aircraft. One B-29 was shot down by enemy fire, while another 5 crashed on landing. The next major air operation was planned for the night of August 10th into the 11th, 1944. This time, they set their sights on a critical Japanese oil refinery. They also targeted massive fuel storage tanks in Palembang on the island of Sumatra. It was hard to overstate the importance of this target. It held nearly 40% of the empire's entire oil reserves. The mission was a logistical nightmare. The bombers had to stage through a British airfield in Ceylon. The heavy bombers had to cover an incredible distance over the Bay of Bengal. It was nearly 1,860 miles. To do this, they had to severely reduce their payload. Each aircraft carried just 2,000 pounds of bombs. A total of 54 bombers took part in the operation. Only 1 aircraft failed to return. Fortunately, its crew was rescued. The target itself was right on the coastline. This made it a lot easier to pick up on radar in the dark. Roughly half the crews managed to hit the designated target area. But once again, the overall bombing results left a lot to be desired. Interestingly enough, that same night, a small group of B-29s took off from a forward operating base in China. They were heading for a parallel strike against Japan. They dropped their bombs on an aircraft engine plant in Nagasaki. However, they caused only minimal damage to the facility. The 20th Bomber Command had been flying combat missions for over 2 months now. But the results were downright dismal. The massive Operation Matterhorn was clearly stalling out. It was failing to deliver the success everyone expected. High Command, specifically General Henry Hap Arnold, was incredibly frustrated. He pinned the blame for all these failures squarely on the command's leadership. The situation changed dramatically in late summer. On August 29, 1944, Major General Curtis E. LeMay arrived in India. This outstanding commander had already made a name for himself in Europe. There, he successfully commanded the 3rd Bombardment Division of the U.S. 8th Air Force. Wasting no time, on September 8th, LeMay took an unprecedented step. He personally led the 20th Bomber Command in a massive raid. The target was the Showa steel plant in the Manchurian city of Anshan. It is worth noting that generals of his rank were strictly forbidden from personally flying combat missions. But LeMay managed to convince his superiors and secure a one-time exception. The gamble paid off, as the attack was incredibly successful. Out of the entire strike force, only 14 aircraft were forced to abort. Meanwhile, 95 B-29 heavy bombers successfully reached the target. Thanks to perfect weather conditions, the crews were able to drop their payloads with maximum accuracy. As a result, the production capacity of the strategically important plant dropped by 1/3. During this mission, Japanese anti-aircraft fire managed to shoot down only 1 B-29. However, 3 more American bombers were lost to mechanical issues. In his new role, LeMay actively applied his extensive European combat experience. For instance, on daylight missions, he ordered crews to ditch the usual 4-ship formation. Instead, the bombers now formed a tight 12-plane combat box. All 12 crews dropped their bombs simultaneously. This was done strictly on the command of the lead bomber. Additionally, the general introduced a new tactic. Special Pathfinder planes were sent far ahead to locate the target first. They would then mark it for the main strike force. Another major innovation was the order to use a dual targeting approach. Crews aimed through the traditional optical bomb sight while simultaneously tracking via radar. This combined method significantly reduced the chances of a miss. This was especially effective when the target was completely obscured by thick clouds or undercast. Later on, LeMay completely reorganized the 58th Bombardment Wing. This was the main striking force of the 20th Bomber Command. Previously, the structure of this unit was somewhat bloated and inefficient. Each of the 4 groups had 4 small squadrons, fielding only 7 B-29s each. LeMay decided to cut the red tape and disbanded 1 squadron in each group. As a result of this restructuring, each group now consisted of 3 powerful squadrons. They were equipped with exactly 10 bombers each. This significantly streamlined coordination, as well as the overall command and control of such massive formations in the air. The next raid on Anshan in late September did not yield any outstanding results. However, the psychological turning point in the war had already arrived. On October 25, 1944, American crews attacked a Japanese aircraft plant. This was located in the city of Omura on the island of Kyushu. For this mission, they used a devastating mixed payload of high explosives and incendiaries. The results of the strike proved extremely effective. By November 11th, the 20th Bomber Command carried out a successful strike on Nanking, a city the Japanese had occupied since 1937. However, the enemy was not sitting idle either, and they were constantly bolstering their air defenses. For example, during another raid on Omura on November 21st, the Americans were suddenly intercepted. A massive swarm of Japanese fighters and twin-engine interceptors engaged them. The Japanese pilots were extremely aggressive. They climbed above the tight American bomber formations to drop white phosphorus aerial bombs directly into the combat boxes. In that fierce battle, 6 B-29s were lost. The bomber wing suffered equally heavy losses in early December during a raid on the Manchurian city of Mukden. The problems were not just up in the sky, they were happening on the ground too. The forward U.S. airfields around the Chinese city of Chengdu became targets for enemy night raids on several occasions. The Japanese had an extensive spy network in the surrounding villages. Under the cover of darkness, these spies would light large bonfires. These fires acted as perfect navigational beacons for Japanese bombers. Fortunately, the actual damage from these attacks was minimal. The Japanese only managed to destroy a single C-54 transport parked on the flight line, and they burned up some of the aviation fuel dumps. To secure the bases from further threats, specialized Northrop P-61 Black Widow night fighters were put on alert at the airfields in early October. They quickly and effectively took over air defense. Despite their recent successes, the 20th Bomber Command was still taking heavy losses. By the end of 1944 alone, they had lost a total of 147 B-29 Superfortresses. To put that in perspective, those losses essentially equaled the command's entire bomber fleet back in May of that year. The majority of these losses did not come from enemy action. Instead, they resulted from crashes caused entirely by mechanical failures. On average, about 17% of the bombers launching on a combat mission suffered serious engine or system malfunctions. Engineers did not manage to significantly improve the aircraft's reliability until February 1945. On top of that, the rapidly approaching winter threatened to drop bombing accuracy even further due to the terrible weather. Supplying these forward airfields by flying the hump over the Himalayas was also an absolute logistical nightmare. The transport route ran directly through airspace heavily patrolled by enemy fighters. And if an American crew bailed out over the icy peaks, they had practically zero chance of surviving those brutal and unforgiving conditions. The second-to-last B-29 mission flown out of the Chinese airfields was a massive tactical raid. The primary goal was to stop the advance of Japanese forces. They were making a major push toward the city of Kunming. On December 18, 1944, bombers dropped incendiaries on a critical Japanese supply base located in Hankou. Shortly after, the U.S. military command made the decision to phase out bomber operations from the Chengdu bases. The B-29s flew their final combat mission from Chinese soil on January 15, 1945. This time around, the bombers targeted Japanese military installations on Formosa, which we know today as Taiwan. This attack also had an underlying strategic motive. U.S. commanders were trying to draw Japanese attention away from the Allied troop landings on the Philippine island of Luzon. Moving forward, all the B-29s belonging to the 58th Bomb Wing were relocated to bases in India. Throughout the first quarter of 1945, these heavy bombers flew regular combat sorties against strategic targets scattered across Southeast Asia. They hammered targets in Singapore, French Indochina, China, Burma, Thailand, and Malaya. In Singapore, for example, they heavily bombed the naval dry docks. This included critical targets like the King George VI dock. They had previously attacked this dock on November 5, 1944. Another target was the Admiralty 9 dock, which was struck on February 1, 1945. Meanwhile, back in China, American aircraft were busy executing aerial mining operations in the shipping lanes of the massive Yellow and Yangtze rivers. These high-risk sorties were successfully carried out on March 4th and March 28th. On that same day, March 28th, a force of 50 B-29s took to the skies from those airfields in India. Their mission was to carry out a large-scale aerial mining operation along the sea lanes around Saigon, Singapore, and the strategically vital Cam Ranh Bay. The 20th Bomber Command flew its final combat mission out of India on March 29, 1945. On that mission, the squadron struck a massive fuel and oil storage depot on Bukom Island just off the coast of Singapore. By the spring of 1945, the 58th Bomb Wing had permanently relocated from India to the Pacific island of Tinian in the Marianas. This followed an initial build-up phase in the Mariana Islands. This phase ran from November 1944 through January 1945. Back in the fall of 1944, General Henry Hap Arnold came to a firm conclusion. Any further attempts to launch air raids from Chinese bases were simply unsustainable. Operating from bases in the Marianas made a lot more sense. From there, the B-29's combat radius would allow them to easily reach most of the Japanese home islands. The island chain sat roughly 1,490 miles southeast of Tokyo. But the greatest strategic advantage of the Marianas was that they could be easily resupplied by sea. Fully grasping the strategic value of the islands, U.S. forces launched an amphibious assault on Saipan on June 11th. After securing the area, troops continued their advance. They landed on Guam on July 20th and on Tinian by July 23rd. Remarkably, on June 24th, while fierce fighting was still raging on Saipan, construction of a new airfield was already underway. This massive job fell to the men of the Naval Construction Battalions, famously known as the Seabees. They were tasked with quickly repairing the captured Japanese airstrip at Aslito. This airstrip was later renamed Isili Field. Early in the reconstruction, the base could only handle fighters, but command had much bigger plans, calling for 2 massive paved runways. Each was slated to stretch an impressive 9,000 feet. Only a facility of that scale could safely handle fully loaded B-29s. In August and September 1944, Seabees worked around the clock on Saipan. Meanwhile, a brand new bomb wing was standing up half a world away in Kansas. It was equipped with the latest B-29s and designated as the 73rd Bomb Wing. It consisted of 4 bomb groups. Each group was made up of several squadrons flying about a dozen bombers apiece. Initially, Top Brass planned to deploy the wing to India. However, the successful capture of the Marianas completely changed the plan. The new wing was placed under the direct control of the 21st Bomber Command. Taking command was Brigadier General Haywood S. Hansell, Jr. He was a highly experienced officer who had served as Chief of Staff for the 20th Air Force right up until August 1944. General Hap Arnold personally ordered Hansell to act immediately. He was to begin prepping and launching large-scale air raids against the Japanese home islands. These strikes would be launched directly from these new bases in the Marianas. Then, on October 18, 1944, the first B-29 touched down on the still unfinished runway at Isili Field. Fittingly, Brigadier General Hansell himself was at the controls. At that time, only one paved runway could handle the heavy bomber. It measured just 6,000 feet. Conditions for the men were incredibly Spartan. The base had no dedicated hangars or even basic shelters to protect the aircraft from the elements. Yet, despite the harsh living conditions, over 100 B-29s were successfully relocated to Saipan by the end of November 1944. Before leaving the United States, General Haywood Hansell received crystal-clear orders. The main objective for the 21st Bomber Command was the total destruction of industrial targets on the Japanese home islands. However, the very first combat missions launched from the Marianas were actually much more tactical in nature. On October 28, 1944, 18 B-29s took off to strike a Japanese submarine base on Dublon Island. This island was located roughly 600 miles southeast of the Marianas. Unfortunately, 4 aircraft were forced to turn back due to engine trouble. The remaining crews dropped their bombs, but the results of the raid were minimal. 2 follow-up attacks on Dublon Island occurred on October 30th and November 2nd. These attacks also failed to achieve the desired results. The Japanese did not waste any time. They struck back the very same day as the third raid on their submarine base. Enemy bombers flying out of Iwo Jima attacked the American base on Saipan on November 2nd. They severely damaged more than 10 B-29s. This bold attack forced American commanders to launch several retaliatory raids against Iwo Jima. But the strikes on November 5th and November 11th were largely ineffective. Following this string of fruitless missions, General Henry Hap Arnold began putting heavy pressure on Hansell. He demanded that large-scale strategic bombing of the Japanese mainland begin as soon as possible. The situation was complicated by the fact that maintenance crews still had not fully resolved the notorious engine reliability issues of the B-29. Furthermore, the fresh crews arriving from the States had absolutely no combat experience. The first major raid on Japan was scheduled for November 17, 1944. However, poor weather moved in, and the mission had to be scrubbed. On the plus side, ground crews took full advantage of this unexpected delay. They gained precious time to work on the temperamental engine cooling systems of the bombers. Finally, on November 24, 1944, a massive fleet of 111 B-29s took to the air from Saipan. Leading this powerful formation was the commander of the 73rd Bombardment Wing, Brigadier General Emmett Rosie O'Donnell. He flew aboard a B-29 named Dauntless Dottie. The aircraft was piloted by Major Robert K. Morgan. Major Morgan was a seasoned 8th Air Force veteran who had previously flown in the brutal bombing campaigns over Germany. The primary target was the massive Nakajima aircraft engine plant located in Musashino, just outside Tokyo. According to intelligence reports, this single facility produced up to a third of all aircraft engines for the Japanese military. Notably, this was the first strike on the Japanese capital since Jimmy Doolittle's famous raid. During the flight, 17 bombers were once again forced to abort due to engine failures. The remaining aircraft were flying at altitudes between 27,000 and 32,000 feet. They suddenly encountered an atmospheric phenomenon completely unknown to them at the time. It was a massive, high-altitude wind current that we now know as the jet stream. The incredibly strong winds in the upper atmosphere scattered the formation. This made an accurate, coordinated bomb run practically impossible. To make matters worse, heavy cloud cover had rolled in right over the target area. Because of these incredibly difficult conditions, only 24 aircraft managed to drop their payload directly on the factory complex. The rest of the bombers ended up dropping their bombs blindly over Tokyo. During this mission, one B-29 was lost to an enemy fighter. Just 3 days later, on November 27, 1944, 81 B-29 Superfortresses took off. Their mission was to strike the industrial zones and docks around Tokyo and Hamamatsu. That very same day, 17 Japanese A-6M0s based out of Iwo Jima carried out a desperate surprise raid on Saipan. This attack caught the American forces completely off guard. It left 7 B-29s either destroyed or heavily damaged on the flight line. But even after that heavy loss, just 2 days later, the B-29s were back in the air. They were heading out to bomb industrial targets in Tokyo, Yokohama, and Numazu. The weather was clear this time around, but dropping bombs from 27,000 feet just was not very effective. Japanese fighters managed to shoot down 6 bombers on that mission. Despite the heavy resistance, on December 3rd, 70 bombers launched another strike on Tokyo. Then, on December 8th, more than 60 B-29s hit Japanese airfields on the island of Iwo Jima. The first truly successful and devastating raid by the 21st Bomber Command took place on December 13, 1944. That day, over 70 B-29s launched a massive strike on the sprawling Mitsubishi aircraft and engine plant in Nagoya. The bomber crews managed to destroy about 17% of the facility buildings. This instantly cut its production capacity by a quarter. 5 days later, on December 18th, 63 bombers returned to Nagoya. This time, heavy cloud cover meant the crews had to rely entirely on radar to drop their payloads. As a result, the bombs ended up hitting Mitsubishi warehouses. These buildings were not critical to the actual manufacturing process. On December 22nd, 48 B-29s returned to drop incendiary bombs on that same plant. But history repeated itself. Poor visibility forced them to bomb by radar again. The main production lines were left completely untouched. On December 24th, 23 B-29s took off from Saipan to strike Japanese airfields on Iwo Jima. The very next day, the Japanese launched a fierce retaliatory strike. They sent 24 of their own fighters. The attack left 11 B-29s burning on the tarmac, while another 43 Superfortresses sustained heavy damage. As time would tell, however, this turned out to be the last truly successful Japanese air raid of its kind. Overall, the results of those early combat missions from the new bases in the Marianas fell far short of expectations. American air operations in the region ran into a whole host of problems. Harsh winter weather made the jobs of the crews incredibly difficult. Jet stream winds reaching 150 miles an hour made high-altitude precision bombing virtually impossible. Over the last 2 months of 1944, American commanders were launching combat missions about once every 4 days on average. The cost was high every single time, losing 5 or 6 heavy bombers per raid. When you consider that a B-29 carried an 11-man crew, the math was just grim. Roughly 50 highly trained airmen were being lost on a single raid. Paying that kind of price for missions that were not delivering real results was simply unacceptable. On top of that, they were not even achieving any significant psychological or propaganda impact on the enemy. The primary objective for the bombers was still to wipe out Japanese industrial targets. But that was the one goal they just could not seem to achieve. Because of this, General Henry Hap Arnold was forced to make some tough personnel decisions. In early January 1945, General Haywood Hansell was relieved of his command. General Curtis LeMay then took over the bomber force. The firebombing of Japanese cities. Back in November 1944, General Henry Hap Arnold and Major General Loris Norstad had a detailed report from economic experts land on their desks. The document covered the state of the Japanese Empire's entire defense industry. The analysis made it clear. The vast majority of vital military plants were packed into just 4 major cities. These were Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and Kobe. But the most crucial point was that a massive chunk of their production capacity was dispersed into small workshops. These were scattered throughout the densely packed wooden residential neighborhoods of these cities. The experts came to a staggering conclusion. Blanketing these districts with incendiary bombs would have 5 times the destructive impact on the industry, compared to precision strikes on the major factories. In mid-December 1944, Brigadier General Haywood S. Hansell got a direct order to organize a massive, all-incendiary raid. But Hansell, a die-hard believer in high-altitude precision bombing, pushed back hard. On top of that, he had absolutely no desire to unleash hell on the civilian population and burn entire cities to the ground. Major General Loris Norstad stood his ground, though. He assured him this would just be a single, purely experimental mission to test the theory. Highly reluctant, Hansell eventually agreed. On January 3, 1945, the mission went ahead. Nagoya was chosen as the first target. This time, the B-29 crews were given a very specific objective. They were to drop their incendiaries right on the neighborhoods where intelligence said those small military workshops were hidden. The results of the raid, however, fell short of expectations. This was true even though several massive fires broke out in the city and a large textile factory burned to the ground. On January 19, 1945, tactics shifted. 62 B-29 Superfortresses, each hauling 5,000 pounds of high explosives, hammered the Kawasaki aircraft plant in Akashi. This time, the facility was completely wiped out. Without a doubt, it was the most successful raid since the B-29 first saw combat. Major General Curtis LeMay decided to keep pressing on with these precision strikes. But that strategy did not last long. Soon after, Norstad handed down a hardline order to switch back to incendiary tactics. The military executed the order on February 4, 1945. This time, Kobe was in the crosshairs. The operation pulled in not just the veteran crews, but also a massive new bomb wing commanded by Brigadier General John H. Davies. The home for his fresh crews was the newly built North Field on the island of Tinian. It was an absolute giant of an airbase. It boasted 4 runways nearly 8,500 feet long, backed by an incredibly robust infrastructure. This new style of warfare demanded some serious changes in how the American bomber forces were organized. And while the incendiary attacks proved undeniably effective, they also meant a colossal, catastrophic toll on the civilian population. The Americans launched 2 of these devastating raids against Tokyo. On February 25, 1945, an armada of 172 B-29s hit the Japanese capital. Then, on March 4th, they struck again on an even larger scale. They launched a force of 192 bombers. The aftermath was horrific. In the first of those 2 raids alone, over 28,000 buildings in Tokyo were reduced to ash. General LeMay decided to push the destructive power of these raids even further. He realized that the main factors killing their bombing accuracy were the massive high-altitude winds of the jet stream and extremely heavy cloud cover. So, a perfectly logical idea emerged: scrap the high-altitude daylight raids and drop down to low altitude for night attacks using nothing but incendiaries. This shift in tactics allowed crews to lighten the aircraft as much as possible. The heavy upper and lower gun turrets were stripped from the bombers. This left only the tail gunner position for defense. Flight altitudes were drastically reduced. Instead of the usual 25,000 to 30,000 feet, the aircraft would now come in at just 5,000 to 6,000 feet. This decision brought several major advantages right away. It significantly cut fuel consumption and eased the strain on the engines. Plus, coming in under the cover of darkness kept the threat from Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire to an absolute minimum. More than 300 bombers took part in the first large-scale raid using this new tactic. Brigadier General Thomas S. Power led the massive strike. At noon on March 9, 1945, 325 aircraft took off from airfields in the Marianas. Closer to midnight, 279 B-29s arrived over Tokyo. They dropped 1,665 tons of incendiaries on the city. Strong surface winds instantly fanned the flames. This created a devastating firestorm over the Japanese capital. By the morning of March 10th, over 15.5 square miles right in the heart of Tokyo had burned to the ground. The blaze killed more than 84,000 civilians. It left over 1 million more homeless. In just a single night, more people died here than in either of the atomic bombings. The cost of this horrific success for the U.S. Army Air Forces was 14 B-29s lost. The attacks did not stop there. On the night of March 11th, a similar raid hit Nagoya. This time, 285 bombers dropped 1,700 tons of incendiaries. This turned almost 2 square miles of urban sprawl to ash. The next target was Osaka. On the night of March 13th, 274 aircraft completely destroyed about 8 square miles of the city. Then it was Kobe's turn. On the night of March 16th, 331 B-29s scorched another 3 square miles of city blocks. A fifth, equally devastating raid struck Nagoya once again. On the night of March 18th, 290 bombers hit the city. This caused damage entirely on par with the first attack. After this, Bomber Command had to pause operations. The reason was simple. The island bases had completely run out of incendiary bombs. This forced crews to load standard high explosives for the final 2 missions. The statistics from these early firebombing campaigns heavily favored the Americans. Japan lost nearly 32 square miles of dense urban development across its 4 largest metropolitan areas. Countless strategically vital industrial facilities went up in flames. The terrifying firestorms claimed the lives of over 120,000 Japanese civilians. Meanwhile, more than 100,000 others suffered varying degrees of burns. Against the backdrop of these apocalyptic numbers, U.S. bomber losses seemed remarkably light. Just 20 aircraft were lost. This represented slightly more than 1% of the total fleet participating in these massive raids. In April 1945, the command of the U.S. 20th Air Force issued a new directive that significantly altered their approach. From then on, crews were expected to combine two different tactics. These were wide-area saturation bombing with incendiaries and high-altitude precision strikes using high explosives. As soon as the stockpiles of incendiary munitions were replenished, the Army Air Forces launched another massive raid. On April 13th, an armada of 330 heavy bombers took off heading for Tokyo. Nearly all of them successfully reached the target. They dropped over 2,300 tons of ordnance directly onto the Tokyo military arsenal. The attack burned nearly 11 square miles of city blocks completely to the ground. Japanese air defenses managed to shoot down just 7 American bombers during the raid. On the night of April 15th to 16th, over 100 bombers hammered Tokyo once again. At the same time, nearly 200 more aircraft headed for the city of Kawasaki. 13 crews failed to return to base that night. A month went by, and once new shipments of incendiaries arrived from the States, a new wave of devastating attacks was unleashed against Japan. Just to give you an idea of the scale, on May 14th, over 470 aircraft hit Nagoya. On May 17th, nearly the same number of bombers hit Tokyo again. The Japanese capital was struck 2 more times, on May 23rd and May 25th. Each time it was hit by over 450 bombers. On May 29th, a massive firestorm engulfed Yokohama as 454 bombers struck the city. As summer began, the onslaught continued. Osaka took massive hits on June 1st and June 7th, while the city of Kobe was pounded on June 5th. But American forces were taking heavy losses during these raids too. Japanese fighter pilots defended their airspace with absolute desperation. On the night of May 24th, 17 B-29 heavy bombers failed to return from their mission. Just 2 days later, the Americans lost another 26 aircraft. The aftermath of this bombing campaign was absolutely catastrophic for Japan. Roughly 40% of the total urban area across all the targeted cities was reduced to ashes. Putting together an armada this huge for a single raid was only possible because of a massive redeployment. The 58th Bombardment Wing was transferred all the way from India to bases much closer to Japan, specifically to the Mariana Islands. Starting in mid-April 1945, these units were operating out of the airfields on Tinian. They flew their first combat mission from this new base on May 5th, delivering a heavy strike on the city of Kure. By mid-June 1945, American commanders shifted their strategy. They rolled out a new plan calling for massive strikes against 58 smaller cities. These were specifically places with populations ranging from 100,000 to 200,000 people. In just 2 months of relentless raids, American aircraft burned out over 72 square miles of urban area. This widespread destruction hit cities like Kagoshima, Omuta, Hamamatsu, Yokkaichi, Fukuoka, and Shizuoka. With Japanese anti-aircraft and fighter defenses practically exhausted and offering almost no resistance by this point, General Curtis LeMay made an unusual decision. He ordered that civilians be warned in advance of upcoming bombings. On July 27th, B-29 crews dropped over 660,000 leaflets over 11 Japanese cities slated as the next targets. The very next night, 6 of those cities were leveled by devastating strikes. Thanks to the warning, a lot of residents managed to evacuate the targeted areas in time. This dramatically reduced the number of civilian casualties. Precision bombing. In the spring, specifically on March 7, 1945, U.S. military commanders wrapped up preparations. This was for a massive amphibious assault on the island of Okinawa. The main heavy air support for the ground forces was supposed to come from the B-29 stationed in the Marianas. The heavy bombers flew their first missions in support of the operation on March 27th. Over 150 Superfortresses attacked the aircraft factory in Omura. They also targeted key airfields on the neighboring island of Kyushu. After flying a few more waves of raids, American forces managed to put almost every enemy runway in the region out of commission. Initially, Pacific Fleet headquarters insisted on continuing the bombing campaign. The reason was simple. The Japanese were still launching kamikaze aircraft from a handful of surviving airstrips. However, intelligence later revealed a crucial detail. These suicide pilots were actually taking off from improvised dirt strips. These strips were practically impossible to spot and destroy from the air. Realizing these strikes were ineffective, the Americans officially called off further attacks against Kyushu on May 11th. The massive success of the initial low-altitude night attacks gave military planners a new idea. They decided to attempt precision bombing under those same conditions. The concept was straightforward. Targets would first be illuminated using flares and scattered incendiaries. In practice, however, this quickly fell apart. The highly touted Norden bomb site proved completely useless in the dark. In addition, the crews lacked the specific training for precision night operations. Ultimately, they abandoned the experiment and returned to their proven area bombing tactics. The main change was lowering the bombing altitude. It went from 25,000 to 20,000 feet. This significantly improved the overall effectiveness of the strikes. In February 1945, U.S. Marines captured the strategic island of Iwo Jima. This opened up new tactical possibilities. Fighter bases could now be positioned much closer to the Japanese home islands. Most importantly, the heavy bombers would finally have a reliable fighter escort over their targets. On March 6th, aircraft from the 15th Fighter Group touched down at Southfield. These were the legendary P-51D Mustangs. Shortly after, on March 15th, the 21st Fighter Group also arrived on the island. They were flying the same formidable fighters. The next major offensive took place on April 7th. A massive formation of 153 B-29s took to the skies from airfields in the Mariana Islands. Their mission was clear: strike the Mitsubishi aircraft engine plant in Nagoya. Simultaneously, another force of over 100 Superfortresses set off. They were to attack a second strategic target. This was the Nakajima aircraft plant in Tokyo. To provide fighter cover for the mission, 91 P-51D Mustangs launched from Iwo Jima. To extend their range, each fighter was equipped with two 110-gallon drop tanks. This extra fuel allowed the Mustangs to escort the bombers all the way to the target. It also ensured they could safely make it back home again. The operation was meticulously planned. Dedicated B-29 rescue aircraft patrolled along the flight path. They were standing by to drop life rafts to any crews forced to ditch in the ocean. The U.S. Navy also positioned several submarines along the route. These were specifically tasked with rescuing downed airmen. The results of the raid exceeded Bomber Command's highest expectations. Over 1.2 million pounds of high explosives were dropped on the Mitsubishi plant in Nagoya. The intense bombardment nearly leveled the complex. It destroyed 90% of the facility. The attacks did not stop there. On April 12th, 94 B-29s struck another key Nakajima engine plant. This time, the target was in Musashi. By the end of the raid, the facility was completely obliterated. Strategically, this was an absolute disaster for Japan. It resulted in the near-total collapse of their aircraft engine industry. The country essentially lost the capacity to manufacture new airplanes. To compound the damage, on that same day, over 130 American bombers carried out yet another devastating raid. They reduced a major chemical plant in Koriyama to ruins. Shortly after, the Allied air forces in the Pacific received a massive influx of reinforcements. A new bomber wing, fresh from the United States, joined the 20th Air Force. The wing set up its new base at Northwest Field on the tropical island of Guam. Thanks to these fresh arrivals, the total striking power of the 20th Air Force swelled to an incredible 700 B-29 Superfortresses. Command of this unit went to the highly experienced Brigadier General Frank Armstrong. This was the exact same commander who, back in 1942, led the very first B-17 Flying Fortress raid against targets in occupied Europe. The primary aircraft in the general's arsenal was the B-29B. This was a special variant tailor-made for low-level night bombing. Before even deploying to the Pacific, the crews of these bombers went through intensive specialized training back in the States. They were taught the complex art of night bombing from low altitudes. The crews learned to navigate precisely using cues from Pathfinder aircraft. They also learned to flawlessly read the data from the onboard Eagle radar. General Curtis LeMay laid out a clear strategy. From then on, the primary targets for these bombers would be the enemy's vital oil refineries and strategic petroleum reserves. The results were immediate. Throughout the summer of 1945, the crews flew 15 major combat missions. They managed to completely wipe out 9 key oil depots. These depots had a combined capacity of over 6 million barrels. During a large-scale night raid on June 22nd, a formation of 72 B-29Bs did not just reduce a massive synthetic fuel plant to rubble. The facility was completely flooded after the bombs breached a nearby dam, wiping it off the map. These staggering results were achieved thanks to the flawless coordination and professionalism of the lead crews. They ensured incredibly high accuracy and a tight bomb pattern. When Nazi Germany finally surrendered, General Henry Hap Arnold initiated a massive reorganization of all air forces operating in the Pacific Theater. So, on July 16, 1945, General Curtis LeMay officially took command of the 20th Air Force. That exact same day brought other major personnel shifts. General Carl Spaatz was appointed as the supreme commander of all strategic air forces in the Pacific. He set up his main headquarters right alongside them on the island of Guam. Also on July 16th, another major command deployed to the island of Okinawa. This air force had just wrapped up its victorious campaign in the skies over Europe. It was now actively shifting its forces to the Pacific to finally end the war. A month earlier, General Arnold had personally flown to Okinawa for an inspection. After surveying the area, he concluded that the island's runways were perfectly capable of handling up to 1,000 heavy bombers like the B-17. However, the very first units to arrive at these new bases were equipped with the much more advanced B-29s. Interestingly enough, those veterans of the air war over Europe never actually got the chance to fight in the Pacific. While the massive relocation of their troops and equipment halfway across the globe was still underway, the Japanese Empire announced its surrender. It is also worth noting that in the very final stages of the war, squadrons flying B-24 Liberators appeared in the skies. They operated out of airfields on Okinawa and the neighboring island of Ieshima. This added to the already massive American firepower. And literally just days before the surrender, the brand new B-32 Dominator heavy bombers flew their very first combat sorties over Japan. On top of that, Command was seriously planning to bring in the British Royal Air Force for these mass bombing campaigns. They would be flying their famous Avro Lancaster Mark 7 bombers. The sheer scale of the planned campaign was staggering. The Allies intended to assemble a massive fleet of 10,000 bombers across the Marianas and Okinawa. This was meant to set the stage for Operation Olympic. It was a massive amphibious invasion of the Japanese home islands. The operation was scheduled for November 1st, 1945. If that was not enough, Operation Coronet was being drawn up for March 1946. Its ultimate goal was taking Tokyo. By that point, Allied air power in the region was projected to swell to an unprecedented 16,000 combat aircraft. According to military planners, the bomb tonnage was projected to top 220,000 tons every month. And in just the 24 hours before the ground invasion, some 88,000 tons of ordnance were scheduled to rain down on Japanese cities. It would have unleashed an absolute firestorm from the sky. But by the spring and summer of 1945, Japanese air power was already on its last legs. It was putting up almost no organized resistance. Intelligence estimated the enemy had fewer than 1,000 operational aircraft left in their inventory. The vast majority of their airfields were in ruins, and their already scarce stockpiles of aviation fuel were rapidly running dry. Japanese pilots desperately tried to fend off the bombers with isolated head-on attacks, but with every passing day, their effectiveness plummeted. This brought the inevitable end of the war closer. The intensity and destructive power of the American strategic bombing campaign grew by the day. In July 1945 alone, B-29 crews flew 6,697 combat sorties. During that time, they dropped over 47,400 tons of bombs on enemy targets. Army Air Forces Command rated the accuracy of these strikes highly. This was incredibly impressive. 75% of the time, crews were dropping their payloads using nothing but radar. They were bombing through thick cloud cover with absolutely zero visibility of the target. By early August, they had destroyed or severely damaged 23 major aircraft manufacturing plants, 6 large weapons arsenals, 2 factories producing chemical fuel additives, and 2 massive steel mills. They also took out almost all of the key oil refineries in the country. On top of that, another 540 war production plants were forced to shut down. At the same time, the civilian population was suffering horrific casualties. This dealt a massive blow to the morale of the Japanese people. Civilians fled the major urban centers in droves. They retreated to remote rural areas just to escape the firestorms. The industrial base of Japan was left in absolute ruins, mining the sea lanes around Japan. An in-depth analysis by American intelligence highlighted one critical vulnerability. Japan was completely dependent on seaborne imports for its raw materials. Imports accounted for 80% of the oil in the country. They also accounted for 24% of its coal, 90% of its coking coal for steel production, and 20% of its total food supply. Because of this, crippling their merchant fleet was guaranteed to deal a devastating economic blow to the empire. This is exactly why, in the spring of 1945, heavy bombers began dropping massive numbers of naval mines across the enemy's most vital shipping lanes. Between late June and mid-August, B-29 crews laid around 13,000 acoustic and magnetic naval mines. They heavily mined the narrow Shimonoseki Strait. This strait separates the major islands of Kyushu and Honshu. They also mined the waters of the Seto Inland Sea. Furthermore, they mined all naval approaches to the largest ports. These ports included Aki, Hiroshima, Kure, Nagoya, Noda, Tokyo, and Tokuyama. The results were immediate. Japan's coastal shipping ground to a near-total halt. In just 1 month, 85 ships struck these mines and went to the bottom. These ships had a combined displacement of over 234,000 tons. Overall, airdrop mines accounted for 9.3% of all Japanese shipping sunk during the war. In the end, strategic bombers inflicted massive losses on the Japanese merchant fleet. This rivaled the total tonnage sunk by all American submarines operating during that same time frame. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The massive, top-secret Manhattan Project kicked off back in 1942. It had finally succeeded in creating a devastating atomic weapon. To deliver this unprecedented bomb to its target, the United States military decided to stand up an entirely new, highly specialized unit. This special unit combined a strike squadron flying B-29 strategic bombers. It also included a transport element operating Douglas C-54 Skymasters. Leading this top-secret group was 29-year-old Colonel Paul W. Tibbets, Jr. Despite his youth, the officer brought a wealth of experience to the table. He had already made a name for himself flying heavy bombers over Europe. For this historic mission, the group was equipped with 15 B-29s. These aircraft had undergone extensive and highly classified modifications, specifically to carry the new weapon. By the end of 1944, the crews were already conducting intensive training on delivering these massive payloads. These large-scale exercises took place at the isolated Wendover Army Airfield in Utah. Around 200 mock-ups were shipped out there specifically for training. In size and weight, they were exact ballistic replicas of the real atomic bomb. Thanks to their distinct, bulbous shape, they earned the nickname pumpkins. The most critical tactical maneuver the pilots drilled into muscle memory was a violent, 155-degree breakaway turn. This was executed the split second the payload left the bomb bay. This high-risk maneuver allowed the bomber to put maximum distance between the aircraft and the impending nuclear blast. While the bomb followed its ballistic trajectory along the bomber's original heading, the crew hauled the aircraft into a steep bank and built up airspeed. By the time of the devastating detonation, the bomber could put roughly 8 miles of distance behind it. This gave the crew a real chance of survival. At the end of April 1945, this composite group began transferring its forces to the massive North Field on the island of Tinian in the Marianas. By that point, American military planners had already finalized the list of potential targets for the first nuclear strike. The primary targets included cities like Hiroshima, Yokohama, Kokura, and Nagasaki. It is worth noting that the Americans seriously considered striking Japan's ancient capital of Kyoto. However, they ultimately decided against it at the last minute, sparing the city's unique historical heritage. On May 29, 1945, the 509th Composite Group launched its first flights from the base on Tinian. By June 30th, the crews moved on to active combat rehearsal missions. The massive B-29 bombers would take to the skies and set course for Okinawa. By that time, the island was already under American control. Along the way, pilots practiced navigation and precision bombing using those same pumpkin training bombs. These practice drops were conducted over the nearby island of Rota. On top of that, the group successfully completed 2 long-range combat sorties. They delivered devastating strikes on Japanese installations on the islands of Truk and Marcus. The true dress rehearsal for the upcoming mission came in the form of 12 targeted raids on Japan itself. The bombers flew in small formations of 2 to 6 aircraft. They dropped those same pumpkin bombs on enemy targets. This time, however, they were packed with high explosives. The main idea behind these flights was to psychologically condition the Japanese to the regular appearance of small groups of B-29s. This essentially lulled their air defenses into complacency. According to the plan, the actual atomic bomb would be dropped by a flight of just 3 B-29s. 2 of them acted as observation aircraft loaded with complex measuring instruments and cameras. Meanwhile, on July 16, 1945, in the New Mexico desert, the United States conducted the first successful atomic bomb test in history. Things moved incredibly fast. Just 10 days later, the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis dropped anchor off the coast of Tinian. She delivered the most top-secret cargo of the war. It was the uranium core for the first combat atomic bomb, Little Boy. All the other necessary components were quickly flown in by a C-54 transport. Interestingly enough, on the outside, Little Boy looked just like a standard general-purpose bomb, with a traditional elongated shape. This made it radically different from the other famous weapon, the bulbous Fat Man, and the round training pumpkin bombs. Ultimately, after lengthy strategic discussions, the city of Hiroshima was chosen as the primary target for this unprecedented strike. The historic mission went to a B-29 that would make history under the name Enola Gay. To escort her and record the results of the strike, they assigned 2 more aircraft. The first was the Great Artiste, packed to the brim with scientific instruments. The second was Necessary Evil, which was outfitted with powerful photographic equipment. Major Charles Sweeney took command of the Great Artiste, and First Lieutenant Norman Ray led the crew of Necessary Evil. To ensure the mission went off without a hitch, 3 more B-29s flew out in a separate flight. These were Straight Flush, Full House, and Jabbet 3. Their job was to conduct precise weather reconnaissance over the target areas before the main strike group arrived. On Monday, August 6, 1945, at 1:37 in the morning, the 3 weather recon planes lifted off the runway and vanished into the darkness. At 2:45 in the morning, the main trio took to the air. This included Enola Gay, the Great Artiste, and Necessary Evil. There were 12 crew members on board the Enola Gay, and each had a crucial role to play in this fateful mission. The aircraft commander and pilot was 30-year-old Colonel Paul Warfield Tibbets. Flying alongside him were co-pilot Captain Robert Allen Lewis, navigator Theodore Van Kirk, and bombardier Thomas Wilson Farabee. Also present were 19-year-old radio operator Richard Nelson and experienced flight engineer Wyatt Dusenberry. The aircraft's defensive fire was handled by aerial gunners George Robert Caron and Robert Richard Shumard. Joe Stebrick operated the radar, and Lieutenant Jacob Beezer handled the electronic countermeasures. Also on board were 2 key specialists directly responsible for the atomic payload. These were Lieutenant Morris Jepson and Captain William Sterling Parsons. At 6:07 a.m., the Enola Gay successfully overflew the island of Iwo Jima. There was a massive risk that the fully loaded bomber could crash on takeoff. Because of this, military command had made an unprecedented decision. The final assembly and arming of the atomic payload would be done mid-flight, while airborne Jepson and Parsons made their way down into the cramped bomb bay. There, they manually removed the safety plugs and armed the weapon. At 7:30 a.m., Parsons officially reported to the aircraft commander that the bomb was armed and ready for the drop. At exactly 9:15 a.m., the bomb bay doors snapped open. Little Boy dropped clear of the aircraft, accelerating toward the ground on a ballistic trajectory. There is a common myth in pop culture that the bomb drifted down on a parachute, but in reality, it was a free fall. Immediately after the release, the crew of the Enola Gay executed a sharp 155-degree breakaway turn to the right. They banked hard to distance themselves from ground zero as fast as possible. After 43 seconds of agonizing anticipation at an altitude of 1,850 feet over the Aioi Bridge in downtown Hiroshima, The bomb detonated. The aftermath was apocalyptic. A single explosion caused around 129,000 casualties. 78,000 people were killed instantly. The massive city was reduced to ash. 70,000 buildings were completely destroyed, and over 176,000 people were left homeless. Experts later calculated that inflicting this level of destruction would have required a fleet of 2,000 B-29s. They would need to be fully loaded with conventional high explosives. Tail gunner George Robert Caron was stationed in the back of the Enola Gay. He later confirmed that the terrifying mushroom cloud of fire and smoke was clearly visible. It could be seen even when the bomber was nearly 400 miles away from the blast site. After completing their historic mission, all the aircraft returned to base on Tinian. The round trip lasted a grueling 15 hours. Even after the devastating strike on Hiroshima, the U.S. 20th Air Force continued its massive conventional raids. On August 7th, 131 B-29 heavy bombers took to the skies. They were to strike the naval arsenal in the city of Toyokawa. At the exact same time, nearly 30 more superfortresses were laying mines off the coast. The very next day, August 8th, a massive fleet of 211 B-29s showered the city of Yawata with incendiaries. Meanwhile, a formation of 91 B-29s was wiping parts of Fukuyama off the map. At the same time, another 60 aircraft methodically pounded aviation plants and weapons depots right in the heart of the empire, Tokyo. The dropping of the second atomic bomb, nicknamed Fat Man and loaded with plutonium-239, was originally scheduled for August 11, 1945. Colonel Paul Tibbets entrusted this historic high-stakes mission to Major Charles Sweeney, but they ran into a logistical snag. Sweeney's usual aircraft was already fitted with specialized blast measurement equipment. Because of this, Sweeney had to take the controls of another bomber, normally commanded by Captain Fred Bach. This B-29 was named Boxcar. Fred Bach himself flew the mission at the controls of Sweeney's usual airplane, the Great Artiste. It was exactly because of this temporary aircraft swap that some historical sources later mistakenly reported that the Great Artiste had dropped the second atomic bomb. On the evening of August 7th, Command decided to accelerate the timeline. They pushed the strike date up to August 10th. However, meteorologists reported that the weather over Japan was rapidly deteriorating. To avoid scrubbing the mission due to a storm system, the raid was moved up one more time to August 9th. The bombers lifted off at 3 in the morning. But unlike the first atomic mission, this time things went wrong right out of the gate. Shortly after takeoff, a fuel pump failed. Because of this failure, 600 gallons of aviation fuel in the Bombay auxiliary tanks turned into dead weight. As it approached the coastline, Boxcar was scheduled to rendezvous with a chase plane. By the book, they could only hold at the rendezvous point for a maximum of 15 minutes. During this short window, Major Charles Sweeney spotted a B-29 and moved to intercept. But it turned out to be a completely different bomber flying its own mission. Despite these setbacks, the bomber finally reached its primary target, the city of Kokura. However, the sky was completely obscured by thick cloud cover. After 3 tense bombing runs, Sweeney refused to drop the weapon blind. Getting visual confirmation on the ground was impossible. Running out of options, the aircraft commander made the call to divert to their secondary target. This was the city of Nagasaki, roughly 95 miles away. Even though the Fat Man bomb was significantly more powerful than the Little Boy weapon dropped on Hiroshima, Nagasaki actually suffered less damage. This was because the city, natural terrain, and surrounding hills helped contain the devastating shockwave. Still, an estimated 35,000 people were killed that day, with another 60,000 wounded. The flight home for Sweeney's crew was just as harrowing. Running on fumes down to their last few gallons of fuel, the B-29 barely limped its way to the island of Okinawa. Making matters worse, the local tower simply was not answering their radio calls. Sweeney had to fire off distress flares to finally get their attention. He was signaling his heavy bomber was coming in hot for an emergency landing. Fortunately, Boxcar touched down safely. The crew quickly refueled the aircraft. Then they took off for their home base on Tinian before nightfall. It was only after they were back on the ground that the exhausted pilots heard the massive news. The Soviet Union had officially declared war on the Japanese Empire. As the world was still grasping the sheer scale of the devastation, later that same day on August 9th, Japan was hit by another massive B-29 raid. A strike force of 95 aircraft delivered a crushing blow to an oil refinery in Amagasaki. The final major B-29 air operation of the war took place on August 14, 1945. Just hours before the ceasefire was officially announced, 302 bombers headed out to destroy weapons arsenals in the cities of Hikari and Osaka. Alongside them, 108 aircraft reduced the Marifu railway hub to ashes. Meanwhile, another 132 bombers hammered the oil refinery in Tsuchizaki Minato. On top of that, over 160 B-29s dropped their final incendiary payloads on Kumagaya and Isesaki. At the same time, 39 more planes laid mines in the coastal waters. Even after the ceasefire was declared, American bombers kept patrolling the skies over Japan. They made low-level passes over the islands as a pure show of force. By that point, the 8th Air Force had finished relocating to Okinawa. They were there to link up with the 20th Air Force. Starting on August 27, 1945, the B-29 squadrons were handed a brand new, strictly humanitarian mission. They were executing supply drops filled with food and medical gear for POW camps scattered across Southeast Asia. But a new chapter in aviation history was waiting just over the horizon. This was the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. On June 25, 1950, the North Korean Army crossed the demarcation line dividing the peninsula at the 38th parallel. This marked the outbreak of the Korean War. At the time, the only American unit operating B-29 heavy bombers with enough range to reach Korea was the 19th Bomb Group. They had just 22 of these bombers available. They were operating out of Andersen Air Force Base on the remote island of Guam. By June 27th, General Douglas MacArthur, who was commanding American forces in the Far East at the time, reached out to the head of the Far East Air Forces, General George E. Stratemeyer. MacArthur requested heavy bombing strikes on the advancing North Korean columns. He also requested an airlift to resupply South Korean units. The response was immediate. The very next day, June 28th, 4 B-29s from the 19th flew their first combat mission. Their target was a rail line located just north of Seoul. Just one day later, on June 29th, under direct orders from General MacArthur, 9 B-29s launched a heavy strike. They targeted North Korean military airfields. To streamline operations, on July 8, 1950, the Americans set up a dedicated bomber command in the Far East. They chose Yokota Air Base in Japan as its headquarters. Major General Emmett O'Donnell took command of this new unit. Now, along with the 19th Bomb Group, he had 2 more strategic bomb wings under his command. These were the 22nd and the 92nd, both flying the legendary Superfortress. O'Donnell was also assigned specialized reconnaissance and support aircraft. These included 6 RB-29 recon planes, 24 WB-29 weather recon aircraft, and 4 SB-29 search and rescue planes. Altogether, O'Donnell had just over 100 B-29s of various variants under his command. But those initial combat operations did not yield the expected results. These massive strategic bombers were forced into flying tactical missions. These missions were really meant for smaller, more agile attack aircraft. Realizing this, Douglas MacArthur shifted their tactics. He was following a suggestion from General Hoyt S. Vandenberg. He ordered them to focus their strikes along the 38th parallel. The goal was to sever enemy lines of communication. This would completely cut off the advancing North Korean units from their supply bases. In early August, the B-29 crews were handed a new mission. They were to destroy key rail yards deep behind enemy lines. Between August 4th and August 10th, the bombers launched a series of heavy strikes against the rail network. However, the actual impact of these raids proved to be negligible, so they shifted their targets again. From August 12th to August 20th, the bombers switched to hitting highway and rail bridges north of the 38th parallel. This new strategy paid off. By the end of the month, out of 44 bridges they attacked, 37 were completely destroyed. The remaining 7 were so severely damaged that they were rendered impassable. These results did not come easily for the American air crews, though. The problem was that the crews from the 22nd and 92nd Bomb Wings had been trained exclusively for nuclear strike missions. Technically speaking, their bombers were configured to carry conventional bombs weighing only up to 500 pounds. This simply was not enough payload to bring down heavily reinforced structures. The bombers of the 19th Bomb Group were better equipped for the job. They could drop heavier 1,000-pound and 2,000-pound munitions. But even that did not guarantee an easy win. Those Korean bridges were heavily over-engineered, and knocking them down was notoriously difficult. This was true even with massive 2,000-pounders. For instance, the bombers from the 19th pounded one particular bridge in Seoul. They did this every single day for 3 solid weeks before its supports finally gave way and collapsed. While bomber crews in Asia were grinding through grueling tactical missions, Air Force leadership was drawing up a massive strategic bombing campaign for the entirety of North Korea. The priority target list was extensive. It included army depots and the rail yard in Pyongyang. It also included the oil refinery and seaport in Wonsan. Other targets were massive chemical and metallurgical plants in Hungnam, the steelworks in Chongjin, and the naval base and oil storage facilities in Najin. A secondary target list included 5 large hydroelectric power plants on the country's east coast. To actually pull off such an ambitious plan, they had to urgently reinforce the bomber force. They did this by rushing 2 more bomber wings over to Japan, specifically the 98th and the 30th. The heavy raids on these strategic targets kicked off on July 30th, 1950. It all started with a daytime precision bombing run against a large industrial complex in Hungnam. By early September, American bombers had hit nearly every target on their list. The only exception was the city of Najin. Since it sat just 17 miles from the Soviet border, the president made the call to leave it alone. This was to avoid sparking a broader global conflict. Once they finished with the factories, American air crews shifted their focus to taking out the hydroelectric plants. The first target in this phase was the Fusen hydroelectric plant, which was struck on September the 26th. In October 1950, United Nations forces, spearheaded by American troops, launched a massive offensive. Strategic bombing campaigns had to be temporarily put on hold. This was simply because there were no suitable targets left on the ground for the heavy bombers. By October 27th, a quick American victory was looking like a sure thing. High Command then ordered a portion of the bomber squadrons to rotate back to the States. But right at this turning point, China unexpectedly entered the conflict. Beijing sent an army of thousands of its so-called volunteers to fight in Korea. The situation on the front lines changed completely overnight. On November 1st, American pilots clashed for the first time with the latest Soviet MiG-15 jet fighters. Even so, no strikes were ever launched against targets inside China itself. America deliberately chose not to risk an open war with the Chinese. They knew that kind of move would inevitably trigger direct intervention from the Soviet Union. And that, in turn, would essentially mean the start of World War III. This was something nobody in Washington wanted. Under these new and much tougher conditions, the first mission for the B-29 heavy bomber crews was dropping the bridges across the Yalu River. This river formed the border between Korea and China. This risky aerial operation ran from November 8th through November 25th. The American pilots managed to accurately knock out the southern spans of several strategically vital bridges on the Korean side of the river. Overall, the crossings were left about 65% destroyed. Meanwhile, United States losses were relatively light. The enemy only managed to shoot down a single B-29, while a few other bombers took heavy battle damage. But despite the Air Force's best efforts, the constant flow of enemy troops pouring into Korea from China just would not stop. Under the cover of darkness, Chinese engineers quickly replaced the destroyed bridge sections with floating pontoons. Before long, a deep freeze set in. The river iced over so thickly that they were actually able to lay temporary railroad tracks right across the ice. By the end of 1950, the North Korean Army launched another massive offensive. As a result, American B-29 bombers had to be pulled off their broader strategic missions. They were reassigned to provide close air support for troops on the ground. In February 1951, American commanders mounted another series of long-range raids against targets deep in the north. But this time, the crews were in for a nasty surprise. They were met by high-speed jet fighters and heavy fire from a strong enemy air defense network. During these dangerous sorties, the B-29s were escorted by F-80C and F-84E jet fighters. On February 25th, a flight of 4 bombers striking the city of Suncheon was suddenly jumped by 8 enemy MiG-15s. Just 4 days later, 9 of those same fighters bounced another group of B-29s. This happened right at that vulnerable moment when the American fighter escorts had already broken off to head back to base. The fiercest engagement of all unfolded on April 12th. 48 B-29s from several different squadrons set out to destroy a vital railroad bridge crossing into Manchuria. They were intercepted by a massive formation of over 70 MiG-15s. In the fierce air battle that followed, the Americans lost 3 B-29 bombers. Meanwhile, another 7 aircraft took critical damage and barely limped back to base. In return, the American aerial gunners claimed 9 confirmed kills and 6 probables. This was along with another 6 enemy fighters damaged. After that bloody engagement, American commanders made a tough call. B-29s would no longer be sent to targets deep in enemy territory. From then on, the bombers were reassigned strictly to safer tactical missions along the 38th parallel. These missions were much closer to friendly lines. To improve their night strike accuracy, they started outfitting the B-29s with a new short-range navigation system. This system was known as SHORAN. At first, this advanced equipment went only to the elite bomber units. However, they eventually rolled the technology out across the board. By November 1951, night missions became standard operating procedure for the entire bomber force. By that time, this system had been installed on every single B-29 in theater. During the late spring and summer of 1951, heavy North Korean anti-aircraft fire and highly aggressive Chinese jet fighters became a serious threat for American B-29 crews. In just one summer, 13 B-29s took heavy damage from radar-guided flak. Those enemy guns had no trouble reaching targets even at altitudes of 20,000 feet. On August 14th, a massive strike package of 68 B-29s pounded Pyongyang. Then, on August 25th, 35 bombers unexpectedly showed up over the city of Najin. High Command had previously kept that city off limits, but the rules of engagement had changed. During this daring raid, the crews managed to completely destroy 1.2 miles of railroad track. They also smashed 18 freight platforms and leveled several critical buildings. Throughout August and September 1951, B-29 crews went to work. They systematically dismantled the strategic rail lines connecting the north and south of the country. Bridges in Pyongyang, Suncheon, Sinanju, and the city of Huishan were relentlessly pounded by these devastating strikes. By October, however, the dynamic in the skies had completely shifted. The North Korean fighter forces had grown incredibly strong. Flying daylight bombing raids was practically suicide. If needed, the enemy could scramble up to 200 Soviet MiG-15 fighters at a moment's notice. A devastating battle unfolded during a strike on the Tichon and Namsi airfields. Several dozen MiG-15s packing heavy 23mm and 37mm cannons absolutely tore through the American squadrons. They shot down 5 superfortresses and inflicted heavy damage on 8 more. In that fierce engagement, 55 American crewmen were killed in action. Another 12 were wounded. In return, bomber gunners claimed 11 confirmed MiG kills, plus another 4 probables. Heading into November, losses continued to mount. On top of those 5 B-29s, the Air Force lost another 2 F-84s. They also lost 7 F-86s and 1 RF-80 recon plane. Of course, you have to consider the fog of war. Both sides leaned heavily on propaganda. They routinely overclaimed enemy losses in their reports. Because of this, historians always recommend taking official kill claims from that era with a grain of salt. Having learned a painful lesson, American commanders completely pulled the plug on daylight operations. This started in November 1951. From then on, the massive B-29s flew their missions strictly under the cover of darkness. At first, this shift in tactics worked flawlessly. It allowed the bombers to operate with near impunity. But the enemy was not just sitting idle. Within months, every key strategic target in North Korea was heavily defended. Dense concentrations of radar-guided searchlights were sweeping the night sky. By the spring of 1952, American forces were flying a series of night strikes. These strikes targeted enemy river crossings. They were dropping their bombs from altitudes of 5,000 to 8,000 feet. According to after-action reports, these operations were highly successful. They logged 143 direct hits. On top of that, B-29 crews flew over 400 combat sorties. Their goal was just to pound enemy airfields located south of the Yalu River. Another dramatic engagement unfolded on June 10, 1952. 4 superfortresses set out to destroy a rail bridge near Kwaksan. But just as the bombers approached the target, they were caught in the beams of searchlights. There were about 20 powerful radar-guided searchlights. To make matters worse, a bright full moon silhouetted the aircraft. This completely gave their positions away. Immediately after, Soviet MiG-15s swooped in for the attack. The MiGs won this round, shooting down 3 B-29s. The first heavy bomber exploded in midair. The second went down over North Korean territory. Only the third miraculously managed to limp back across the front lines. It made a hard emergency landing at Kimpo Air Base. Despite the heavy risks, B-29s continued their night raids throughout the summer of 1952. To give the bombers a better chance of survival, ground crews started applying a special night camouflage. They coated the undersides of the fuselage and wings in gloss black paint. Additionally, the bitter lessons learned over Kwaksan forced the Air Force to focus heavily on electronic warfare. From then on, crews actively employed jamming to blind enemy ground radar. They also started timing their sorties with bad weather. This made tracking as difficult as possible for the enemy radar stations. In the summer and fall of 1952, B-29 crews shifted their focus back to key infrastructure. This included bridges, supply depots, large hydroelectric plants, and industrial zones. On July 11th, massive bombing raids struck 30 different targets in Pyongyang simultaneously. Later, a devastating wave of strikes swept across targets in Sungho-ni, Choshin, Sindok, and Sinuiju. Finally, on September 30th, a formation of 45 B-29s completely leveled a large chemical plant. This plant was in the Namsan-ni area. During the winter of 1952 to 1953, night missions became a deadly ordeal. Communist forces had acquired a significant number of specialized night fighters. On top of that, they established dense networks of radar-guided anti-aircraft searchlights. American commanders did everything they could to protect their crews and throw the enemy off balance. Bomber crews flew their missions unpredictably and without a fixed schedule. They were constantly varying their altitudes and approach routes. Pilots also actively avoided flight levels where their aircraft would leave telltale contrails. The most heavily defended strategic targets were hit exclusively during the new moon. They used the pitch black sky for cover. To spoof enemy radar, American crews heavily relied on electronic countermeasures. Despite all these unprecedented precautions, between November 1952 and January 1953, enemy night fighters intercepted and shot down 5 B-29 bombers. The United States Air Force only managed to stabilize the situation by bringing in their own night fighter escorts. The heavy lifting was done by the Douglas F-3D Sky Knight, a naval carrier-based fighter. However, the writing was on the wall. The legendary Superfortress had run its course. These aging giants were simply too vulnerable. They were no longer suited for the harsh realities of the jet age. On April 26, 1953, 2 B-29s flew a rather unusual combat mission. Flying over the Yalu River, they dropped over 1 million propaganda leaflets. These messages were printed in Korean, Chinese, and Russian. They urged enemy pilots to defect and fly their jets over to the United Nations side. They offered a hefty reward of $50,000 to any pilot who defected. To claim this reward, the pilot had to hand over a fully operational MiG-15. On the final day of the war, July 27, 1953, B-29s launched massive strikes. These strikes targeted military airfields at Samcham and Tishan. The primary objective was to wipe out as much enemy infrastructure as possible. This had to be done before the armistice went into effect. Shortly after, American strategic bomber crews dropped several million more propaganda leaflets over North Korean territory. That same day, July 27, 1953, at 15:03 local time, an RB-29 reconnaissance aircraft returned to base. It was commanded by Lieutenant Denver Cook. This return happened just 7 hours before the armistice was officially signed. His crew had been conducting bomb damage assessments. They were evaluating the results of the recent strikes on the North Korean airfields. This specific reconnaissance flight went down in history. It is remembered as the final combat sortie of the B-29.